The Nebraska Territory was a vast, open anvil where the sun hammered down without mercy, flattening the tall prairie grass into a shimmering sheet of gold and brown. It was late August, the time of year when the wind held its breath and the earth cracked open like a dry lip, thirsting for rain that refused to fall. The stagecoach, a mud-splattered Concord coated in the dust of 300 miles, rattled and groaned as it cut a lonely scar across the plains. The leather thoroughbraces creaked in a rhythmic, mournful protest against the uneven ground. Inside, the air was hot and thick, smelling of old leather, sweat, and the stale dust that puffed up through the floorboards with every jolt. Maggie Lane sat rigidly on the velvet bench, her back not touching the cushions. Her gloved hands were folded tightly in her lap, clutching a small box made of rosewood. The corners of the box were worn smooth, the varnish rubbed away by years of nervous thumbs. Inside rested the few tangible fragments of a life that had ended 4 years ago. A silver locket with a broken clasp, a blackened Bible, and the deed to a plot of land that was likely nothing more than ash and weeds. She looked out the window, her blue eyes narrowing against the glare. The landscape rolling past was familiar in a way that made her stomach turn. The low swell of the hills, the specific shade of sage green brushing against the yellow dirt. It all whispered of home, but it was a home that had spat her out. She was 24 years old, though the reflection in the dirty glass showed a woman who looked older, her face thin and watchful. She had told the ticket agent in Omaha that her name was Margaret Sterling. It was a lie, but a necessary one. If the people of Ash Hollow knew that Maggie Lane was returning, the welcome would be as cold as the grave. She intended only to sell the land, take the money, and disappear west toward California. She wanted no apologies, though a treacherous, quiet part of her heart ached for someone, anyone, to look her in the eye and say they were sorry for calling her a murderer. Across from her sat the only other passenger, a stout, older woman named Mrs. Higgins, who had fanned herself with a folded newspaper for the last 40 miles. Mrs. Higgins had tried to make conversation earlier, asking about Maggie's husband or family, but Maggie's curt, one-word answers had finally silenced her. Now, the woman just dozed, her head bobbing with the rhythm of the wheels. The driver, a grizzled man named Silas who had a voice like grinding stones, shouted something from the box above. The whip cracked, a sharp pistol-shot sound that made Mrs. Higgins jump and blink her eyes open. "We are making poor time," Maggie thought. She checked the small watch pinned to her bodice. It was nearly 2 in the afternoon. They should have reached the swing station by now. Then she smelled it. It was faint at first, a ghost of a scent drifting on the rising wind. It was sharp and acrid, cutting through the smell of horse sweat and dust. Maggie stiffened. Her fingers whitened on the rosewood box. It was a smell that lived in her nightmares, a smell that summoned the sound of screaming and the roar of a collapsing roof. Smoke. She leaned forward, pressing her face near the window frame. To the west, the horizon had changed color. The deep, endless blue of the sky was stained with a bruised purple bruise that was spreading rapidly. A gray haze, low and angry, was eating up the distance between the sky and the ground. Silas shouted again, panic threading through his gravelly tone. The coach lurched violently as he whipped the team of 6 horses into a frenzy. "Fire! Mrs." Higgins gasped, clutching her throat. "Oh, Lord, is that fire?" Maggie did not answer. She could not speak. The terror was a cold hand gripping her windpipe. She knew how fast a prairie fire could move. It could outrun a man, outrun a horse, and sometimes, if the wind was wicked enough, it could outrun the devil himself. The wind suddenly shifted, gusting hard from the west, feeding the beast. The line of smoke transformed into a wall of orange and black. The roar became audible now, a low, train-like rumble that vibrated in the teeth. The heat hit the carriage like a physical blow, sucking the moisture right out of the air. The horses screamed, a high, terrible sound of animal terror. The coach swerved violently to the left as the lead team shied away from the blowing cinders. The wheels hit a deep rut in the dry earth. "Hold on," Maggie screamed, bracing herself against the wall. The world tilted. Gravity failed. The heavy Concord stagecoach tipped on two wheels, hung suspended for an agonizing heartbeat, and then crashed over onto its side with the sound of splintering oak and shattering iron. Maggie was thrown across the cabin. Her head struck the wood frame, and darkness starred her vision. She felt the heavy weight of misses. Higgins slam into her, and then they were tumbling. A chaotic mix of skirts, limbs, and luggage. The coach skidded across the hard-packed dirt, grinding rocks and sagebrush into dust, before slamming into a limestone outcrop and coming to a shuddering halt. Silence followed for a second, broken only by the crackle of flames and the whimpering of the horses. Then the heat rushed in. A mile to the north, Cole Harper reined in his black gelding. "Ghost!" The horse danced nervously, tossing its head, smelling the danger on the wind. Cole sat tall in the saddle, a silhouette cut from leather and regret. He was 32 years old, but his eyes were ancient, the color of flint and just as hard. A faded, jagged scar ran from his jawline down his neck, disappearing into the collar of his shirt, a souvenir from a Confederate saber at a place called Chickamauga. He watched the horizon burning. The smoke was a thick, oily curtain being drawn across the world. "Turn around," a voice in his head whispered. It was the voice of self-preservation, a voice he had listened to for years. Ride toward the river. Let it burn. He hated fire. He hated the way it breathed, the way it ate. It reminded him of Atlanta, of the smell of burning cotton and burning flesh. It reminded him of a homestead in Kansas 3 years ago, where he had failed to pull a family from a cellar before the roof came down. The smell of smoke always brought the ghosts back, standing around him, silent and accusing. He saw the dust cloud rise to the south, distinct from the smoke. He saw the dark shape of the stagecoach topple. Cole cursed, a sharp, ugly word lost to the wind. He could ride away. No one would know. He was a drifter, a man of no fixed address and no fixed loyalties. He owed nothing to the fools traveling across the plains in high summer. But his hands were already moving, gathering the reins. His knees tightened against the saddle leather. "Yah!" he shouted, and the black horse surged forward, galloping straight toward the inferno. He rode hard. His hat pulled low to shield his eyes from the flying ash. The heat grew intense, drying the sweat on his face instantly. The roar of the fire was deafening now, drowning out the hoofbeats. He could see the flames licking at the dry grass, leaping 10 feet into the air, devouring the earth in great, hungry gulps. He reached the wreck just as the fire line began to curl around it like a closing fist. The stagecoach lay on its side, the wheels spinning slowly in the air. The horses had broken the tongue of the wagon and bolted, disappearing into the smoke. The driver, Silas, was nowhere to be seen, likely thrown clear and run off, or dead in the grass. Cole dismounted before the horse fully stopped, tying the reins to a scrub oak that hadn't caught fire yet. "Stay," he commanded. Slapping the animal's neck, he ran to the coach. The heat was blistering, singing the hair on his arms. The lacquered wood of the door was already bubbling. "Hello!" he roared, coughing against the acrid smoke. "Is anyone alive in there?" A weak cry answered him. Cole climbed up the side of the overturned carriage, the wood groaning under his boots. He wrenched the door open. It was heavy, jammed by the impact, but he put his back into it and heaved until the latch gave way with a screech of metal. Smoke billowed out, blinding him. He peered into the gloom. At the bottom of the pile, a woman in a heavy travel dress lay motionless, her neck bent at an unnatural angle. "Mrs. Higgins." Cole dropped into the cabin, boots crunching on broken glass. He checked her pulse. Nothing. Her eyes were open, staring at nothing. A line of blood trickling from her ear. Old guilt slammed into him. A physical weight in his chest, another one he hadn't saved, another ghost for the collection. He made to climb out, the heat becoming unbearable. The fire was eating the back of the coach now. He could hear the wood snapping like dry bones. Then, a movement. Underneath the dead woman's skirts, a hand reached out. It was small, trembling, the glove stained with soot. "Help me," The voice was a whisper, cracked and terrified. Cole shoved the dead weight of Mrs. Higgins aside, ignoring the grim reality of it. Beneath her lay Maggie. She was pinned by a heavy travel trunk that had broken loose. Her face was pale beneath a mask of soot, her blonde hair coming loose from its pins. She was coughing violently, her chest heaving as she tried to suck in air that wasn't poison. "Don't move," Cole barked. He grabbed the handle of the trunk. It was solid oak, filled with iron-heavy goods. He gritted his teeth, the cords of his neck standing out as he lifted. His back screamed in protest. "Move, now!" Maggie scrambled backward, her legs shaking, crawling out from under the crushing weight. She tried to stand, but her knees buckled. Cole dropped the trunk and grabbed her. He wrapped one arm around her waist, hauling her up against him. She felt fragile, like a bird made of hollow bones. The heat was a physical enemy now. The varnish on the walls was catching fire, curling into black peels. "We have to go," Cole yelled over the roar. He boosted her up through the open door, climbing out after her. The world outside was a nightmare of orange and gray. The fire had jumped the brake. Flames were licking at the wheels of the coach. Cole jumped down and reached up for her. She hesitated, looking back at the interior where Mrs. Higgins lay. "Leave her," Cole shouted, his voice harsh. "She is gone." Maggie looked at him, her eyes wide and glassy. She looked at the fire surrounding them. She looked at the man standing in the smoke, a stranger with a scarred face and eyes that looked like they had seen hell before. She slid down into his arms. He didn't wait. He grabbed her hand and ran toward his horse. Ghost was dancing on the tether, eyes rolling white with terror. Cole threw Maggie into the saddle, swinging up behind her. He wrapped his arm around her waist, locking her against his chest. "Hold on," he growled near her ear, "and don't let go." He kicked the horse hard. Ghost sprang forward, terrified but trusting the rider. They didn't run away from the fire. They couldn't. The wall was too wide. Cole turned the horse parallel to the flames, aiming for a break in the grass where a rocky wash cut through the terrain. The heat pursued them. Embers rained down like hellfire hail, burning holes in Maggie's dress and stinging Cole's neck. The smoke was blinding. Maggie buried her face in Cole's shirt, sobbing dry, hacking sobs. She could feel the hard muscle of his chest against her back, the steady, rhythmic thud of his heart. For a moment, the fire seemed to reach out for them, a long tongue of flame sweeping across the path ahead. Ghost reared, screaming. Cole fought the animal, forcing the horse's head down. "Yeah, go!" They plunged through the wall of smoke. For 10 seconds, they were inside the fire, the air searing their lungs. Then they broke through. They galloped up a shale slope, the horse's hooves clattering on loose rock. The vegetation here was sparse, giving the fire nothing to eat. They crested the rise and thundered down the other side, putting the stone ridge between them and the inferno. Cole didn't stop until they reached the banks of a shallow, winding creek 3 miles away. The water was low, little more than a muddy trickle, but the banks were wide and made of clay. Safe. He pulled back on the reins. "Whoa, easy, boy, easy." Ghost came to a shuddering halt, flanks heaving, foam dripping from the bit. Cole slid off the horse first, his legs nearly giving out as the adrenaline crashed. He reached up and pulled Maggie down. She hit the ground and collapsed. Her legs refused to hold her. She sat in the dirt, gasping, her chest heaving. Her dress was ruined, the hem burned away, the bodice torn. Her face was blackened with soot, save for the tracks of tears cutting through the grime. Cole stood over her, breathing hard, his hands resting on his knees. He looked back at the ridge. Black smoke billowed into the sky, but the fire hadn't followed them. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rasping. Maggie didn't answer. She was staring at her hands. They were shaking so violently she couldn't clasp them together. She was in shock. The roar of the fire was still in her ears. The smell of the burning coach. The sight of Mrs. Higgins's eyes. It was happening again. Everyone around her burned. Everyone she got close to died in the heat. "Miss?" Cole knelt beside her. He reached out to check her for burns. As his fingers grazed her arm, Maggie flinched as if he had struck her. But then, a sudden, overwhelming desperation seized her. The isolation of the last 4 years, the terror of the crash, the proximity of death, it all crashed down on her at once. She didn't want to be alone. She needed to know she was alive. She needed to feel something other than heat. She lunged forward, grabbing the front of his dirty flannel shirt with both hands, pulling him toward her. "Touch me," she gasped, her voice a broken whisper. Cole froze, his face inches from hers. He could see the gold flecks in her terrified blue eyes. "Touch me before it is too late," she urged, her voice trembling, hysterical. "I need to know I am here, please." It wasn't a seduction. It was a plea for existence. Cole hesitated. He was a man who had sworn off attachments. He was a man who brought ruin. But he looked at this broken, terrified woman, and he felt a crack in the armor he had worn for a decade. Slowly, he raised his hand. He placed his palm against her cheek. His skin was rough, calloused from years of rope and leather, but his touch was incredibly gentle. He ran his thumb across her cheekbone, wiping away a smear of ash. "You are here," he said, his voice low and rumbling like distant thunder. "You are alive. The fire didn't get you." Maggie closed her eyes, leaning into his hand. A sob broke from her throat, raw and painful. She pressed her face against his palm, holding his wrist with her own desperate fingers. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind in the cottonwoods and their ragged breathing. The connection was electric, terrifying in its intimacy. Cole pulled his hand back slowly, clearing his throat. The moment was too raw, too open. He wasn't used to being the savior. He was the survivor, usually the only one. "We need to get you cleaned up," he said, standing up and breaking the spell. He walked to the creek, wetting a rag from his saddlebag. He returned and knelt again, wiping the soot from her hands and face. He worked with a focused efficiency, checking her ribs for breaks, checking her scalp for cuts, water on skin, his rough fingertips grazing her neck, her wrists. Maggie watched him, her breathing slowly evening out. She felt a strange heat rising in her now, one that had nothing to do with the fire. It was shame, yes, shame for her outburst, shame for the woman she had left behind in the coach, but it was also an undeniable pull toward this man. He was scarred and hard-looking, but his hands were careful, as if he thought she might shatter into dust. "What is your name?" Cole asked, dipping the rag back into the water. Maggie hesitated. The lie was ready on her tongue, Margaret Sterling, but the fire had burned away some of her defenses. "I am passing through," she said, dodging the question. "I was heading to Ash Hollow." Cole looked at her, his dark eyes narrowing slightly. He didn't press her. "Ash Hollow is 10 miles east," he said. "The fire is moving that way, but the wind might turn it. The town will be in a panic." "I need to go there," Maggie said, though the thought made her stomach clench. "I need a place to stay." Cole looked at the sun, hanging low and red in the west. "It will be dark in 2 hours. My horse is spent. He can't carry double all the way to town tonight without breaking a leg in a gopher hole." Maggie looked around at the desolate landscape. "Then what do we do?" "I have a place," Cole said, gesturing toward the foothills to the north. "A cabin. It is closer, 3 miles. It isn't much, but it has a roof and it is away from the burn line. I can take you into town come morning." Maggie looked at him, a strange man, a remote cabin, a reputation she didn't know yet, but could guess at by the way he carried his gun, low and tied down. In any other life, she would have run, but she had no water, no weapon, and the smoke was still curling in the sky like a warning. "All right," she whispered. Cole nodded once. He helped her stand. Her legs were steadier now, though she still leaned heavily on him. He lifted her onto Ghost's back again, and this time he walked beside the horse, leading it by the reins to spare the animal the weight. They walked in silence. The land changed as they moved north. The tall prairie grass gave way to scrub brush and rocky soil. They passed a ruined pasture where a fence line had collapsed years ago, the posts gray and rotting like old teeth. Sun-bleached bones of a steer lay scattered near a dry water trough. The skull staring up at the darkening sky. The earth was parched, cracked into a mosaic of thirsty clay. Cole saw Maggie looking at the bones. "Hard country." He said, "It looks dead," Maggie murmured. "It is resting," Cole corrected. "Or maybe it is just waiting for the right spark." "You sound like you know about sparks," Maggie said, her voice quiet. Cole kept his eyes forward. "I worked a ranch east of here for a time. A big spread. Things got ugly. A barn burned down. I learned that fire doesn't care who is right or wrong. It just eats." Maggie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening wind. A barn burned down. The echo of her own history. "Why did you leave?" she asked. "I decided I liked the quiet better than the noise of people," Cole said. "And people decided they didn't much like me around when things started smoking." He fell silent then, closing the door on the conversation. They reached the cabin at dusk. It sat in the shadow of a limestone bluff, a small, sad structure made of weather-beaten boards that had turned silver gray. A leaning fence corralling nothing but dust surrounded it. A line of dark pines stood sentinel on the ridge above, whispering in the wind. It was isolated, desolate, and to Maggie, it looked like the safest place on earth. Cole helped her down. She stood by the door while he led the horse to a lean-to stable, untacking the animal and rubbing it down with dry straw. Maggie watched him. He moved with the economy of a man who lived alone, a man who wasted no motion and no words. Inside, the cabin was sparse. A wood stove in the corner, a rough-hewn table with two mismatched chairs, and a single cot pushed against the far wall. It smelled of coffee, wood smoke, and gun oil. Cole came in, carrying his saddlebags. He lit a kerosene lamp, the yellow light pushing back the shadows. "You take the cot," he said, gesturing to the bed. "I will take the floor." "I cannot take your bed," Maggie protested weakly. "You are the guest," Cole said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And you look like you are about to fall over." He made a simple meal, beans warmed on the stove and stale biscuits from a tin. They ate in silence. The only sound the scraping of spoons and the wind rattling the single window pane. Maggie realized she was trembling again. The shock was wearing off, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. Cole noticed. He poured a cup of water and pushed it toward her. "Drink, then sleep." Maggie nodded. She moved to the cot, sitting on the edge. She felt strange, being in this man's space, surrounded by his scent. "Thank you," she said softly. For coming back. You could have ridden on." Cole stood up, moving to the door to check the night. He looked out at the dark, his back to her. "I thought about it," he admitted, his voice rough. He stepped outside to smoke, leaving her alone to undress. Maggie removed her ruined outer dress, shivering in her chemise and petticoats. She lay down on the cot, pulling the scratchy wool blanket up to her chin. She watched the glow of the stove, her mind replaying the crash, the fire, the feeling of Cole's hand on her face. Sleep claimed her quickly, but it was not a kind sleep. The dream was always the same. She was back in the bakery, the smell of yeast and flour. Then, the sound of breaking glass, the whoosh of air as the fire caught. Her father screaming her name. Her fiancé, Thomas, running into the flames to save the ledger. The heat, the terrible, suffocating heat. People standing in the street, pointing at her. "Careless," they whispered. "Cursed! She did it! She did it!" The flames turned into snakes, wrapping around her ankles, pulling her down. "No!" Maggie screamed, thrashing on the cot. "No, please!" She woke with a gasp, sitting bolt upright. The room was dark. Suddenly, the door burst open. Cole rushed in, a revolver in his hand. He was half-dressed, wearing only his trousers, his feet bare. His chest was broad and scarred, glistening with a sheen of sweat in the moonlight that spilled through the open door. "What is it?" he demanded, scanning the room for a threat. "Is someone here?" Maggie scrambled back against the wall, pulling the blanket up to her neck. She was shaking uncontrollably, tears streaming down her soot-stained cheeks. I am sorry," she stammered. It was a dream. Just a dream. Cole lowered the gun, engaging the safety with a click. He let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging slightly. He looked at her, huddled on his bed, looking small and broken. He holstered the weapon on the table and walked toward her. He stopped 3 feet away, respecting the distance, but his presence filled the small room. "Fire?" he asked quietly. Maggie nodded, unable to speak. Cole ran a hand through his hair. He stood there for a moment, the moonlight catching the jagged scar on his neck. He looked dangerous, wild, and yet he was the only thing anchoring her to the earth. He pulled the single chair from the table and turned it to face the cot. He sat down, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. "I have them too," he said. "The dreams." Maggie looked at him, her eyes adjusting to the dark. "You do? Every time I close my eyes, I smell it." Cole said, "Smoke." He didn't move to touch her. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He simply sat there, a silent sentinel against the dark. "Go back to sleep." "Maggie," he said, using her name for the first time. "I will be right here. I won't let it get you." Maggie looked at him, the bare chest, the scars, the dark eyes watching over her. A confused mix of terror and desire curled in her stomach. She felt safe, and that frightened her more than the fire. She lay back down, pulling the blanket tight, but she didn't close her eyes. She watched him. Cole stayed in the chair. He watched her until her breathing deepened and smoothed out. When he was sure she was asleep, he stood up and walked silently to the table. He picked up his tin cup of coffee, cold as the grave now. He walked to the door and looked out at the distant horizon, where a faint orange glow still stained the night sky. He shouldn't have brought her here. She was trouble, she was broken, and he was a man hanging by a thread himself. "Tomorrow," he whispered to the darkness. "Tomorrow I put her on a wagon to town. I will leave her at the boarding house and ride away." He took a sip of the bitter coffee, grimacing. "I have to," he thought, "before I start to care, before I burn us both down." Morning came not with the golden promise of a new day, but with a gray, sullen light that seemed to bruise the sky. The wind had shifted during the night, dropping the temperature and carrying a biting chill from the north, whistling through the gaps in the cabin's chinking like a dying breath. Maggie Lane woke slowly, dragged from a fitful sleep by the sound of metal striking wood. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The rhythm was steady, relentless. She lay still for a moment, staring at the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling. Her body felt as though it had been trampled by a herd of stampeding buffalo. Every inch of her skin ached. Her left shoulder, where she had struck the stagecoach wall, throbbed with a dull, sickening pulse. She raised a hand to touch her hair and smelled it instantly, the acrid, oily stench of smoke that had settled into the strands. It was the scent of the fire that had almost killed her yesterday, and the scent of the fire that had killed her family 4 years ago. It was a smell that seemed determined to follow her into the grave. She sat up, the wool blanket falling away from her bare shoulders. The air in the cabin was frigid. She shivered, reaching for her ruined dress draped over the back of the chair. The hem was ragged and black, burned away by the embers, but it was all she had. She pulled it on with trembling fingers, wincing as the fabric brushed against a scrape on her hip. Outside, the rhythmic chopping continued. Maggie opened the heavy door and stepped out onto the small porch. The cold wind slapped her cheeks, stinging her eyes. She wrapped her arms around herself, looking out at the world Cole Harper lived in. It was a hard, unforgiving place. The ground was hard-packed earth, stripped of grass by the wind and the hooves of animals. Low sagebrush crouched against the soil, twisted into gnarled shapes as if in pain. To the west, the mountains rose up like a jagged wall of blue iron, indifferent and impassable. There was no softness here, no comfort. It was a land that demanded payment for every breath you took. Cole was by the woodpile. His back to her, he was splitting logs, swinging a heavy axe with a fluid, easy power. He wore a canvas coat that had seen better days, the collar turned up against the wind. His breath plumed white in the air with every exertion. He stopped mid-swing, sensing her eyes on him. He lowered the axe, resting the head on the chopping block, and turned. His face was unreadable, his eyes shadowed by the brim of his hat. He looked like part of the landscape, weathered, silent, and dangerous. "There is coffee on the stove," he said, his voice carrying easily over the wind. "It is strong enough to float a horseshoe, but it is hot." Maggie stepped down from the porch, her boots crunching on the gravel. "Thank you," she said. Her voice sounded thin and fragile in the vast open space. She felt awkward standing there in her tattered finery, a city woman shipwrecked on the shore of his solitude. She watched as he picked up the split wood, stacking it with efficient movements. "How did you sleep?" he asked. Not looking at her, "I survived," she answered, forcing a small, tight smile. "And you?" Cole paused. He looked at the horizon, where the gray clouds were gathering like an army. "I slept enough." He finished stacking the wood and wiped his hands on his trousers. "We need to talk about what happens next. Miss Sterling." He used the name she had given him, but there was a weight to the pause before it, a skepticism that made Maggie's pulse quicken. "I am taking you into Ash Hollow today," he stated flatly. "You need a doctor to look at those bruises. And you need a place with a proper bed and a lock on the door. This cabin is no place for a woman." Panic flared in Maggie's chest, sharp and sudden. Ash Hollow. The name alone made her throat constrict. She wasn't ready. She looked a fright, bruised, dirty, her clothes in tatters. If she walked into town now, looking like a beggar and a victim, the whispers would start before she even reached the main street. They would see Maggie Lane, the cursed girl, returning in shame. She needed time. She needed to armor herself. "I cannot go to town today," she said quickly. Cole narrowed his eyes. "Why not? You are hurt. You need help I cannot give. I am not that hurt," she lied, standing straighter despite the pain in her ribs. "It is just bruises. And I have no money for a doctor or a hotel. My trunk is gone. My purse was inside it." Cole frowned. "I can stake you for a few days. You can pay me back when you get on your feet." "No," Maggie insisted, shaking her head. "I will not take charity. Please, Mr. Harper, I just need a day or two, just to rest, to mend my dress, to catch my breath before I have to face people." Cole crossed his arms, leaning back against the chopping block. He studied her, his gaze dissecting her excuses. "You are afraid of the town," he observed. It wasn't a question. Maggie looked down at her boots, kicking at a loose stone. "I have had a difficult journey. I am not ready to be stared at and questioned." Cole watched her. He saw the tremor in her hands, the way she chewed on her lower lip. He knew fear when he saw it. He had seen enough of it in the war, and enough of it in the mirror. "What are you running from, Margaret?" he asked softly. "And do not tell me it is just the fire. You were running before the stagecoach tipped over." Maggie's head snapped up. Her eyes flashed with a sudden defensive spark. "Everyone runs from something, Mr. Harper," she said, her voice sharpening. "Or are you living out here in the middle of nowhere because you simply enjoy the conversation of cows and coyotes?" It was a bold deflection, and she saw it land. Cole's jaw tightened. The scar on his neck seemed to stand out more vividly against his skin. "There are old stories," she continued, lowering her voice, realizing she had pushed a dangerous man. "Stories people like to keep alive. I do not plan to be their ghost. I just need a little time to prepare myself. That is all." Cole stared at her for a long moment, the wind tugging at his coat. He was irritated by her evasiveness, by the secrets she was clearly clutching as tightly as she had clutched that rosewood box yesterday. But he was also curious. She had fire in her, this terrified little bird. He sighed, a sound of resignation. 2 days, he said. "You can stay 2 days, but you earn your keep. I am not running a hotel. I can cook," Maggie said eagerly, stepping forward. "And I can mend. And I can clean." Cole looked at the cabin, then back at her. "Don't touch my guns. And stay away from the black stallion in the corral. He bites. I will be useful," she promised. You won't even know I am here." Cole snorted, picking up his axe again. "Lady, I doubt that very much." The fragile truce held. Over the next 3 days, they fell into a routine that was as awkward as it was necessary. Maggie took over the interior of the cabin. She attacked the grime of bachelorhood with a ferocity that surprised even herself. She scrubbed the floorboards on her hands and knees until the wood grain emerged from beneath layers of mud. She reorganized the pantry, lining up the tins of beans and sacks of flour with military precision. She found a sewing kit in one of Cole's drawers, mostly thick thread for repairing leather, and sat by the window for hours, painstakingly mending the tears in her dress, turning the ruined garment into something humble but respectable. Cole spent the daylight hours outside. He was a man of ceaseless labor. He repaired the leaning sections of the corral fence, replacing rotted posts with fresh cedar he dragged down from the ridge. He checked the hooves of his small herd of cattle, 20 head of bony, tough longhorns that seemed to survive on dust and stubbornness. They spoke little. Their conversations were functional, constructed of nouns and verbs with no adjectives to soften them. More wood needed. Stew is ready. Wind is picking up. But in the silence, there was an awareness. Maggie would watch him through the window as he worked, admiring the easy strength in his shoulders, the way he handled the animals with a firm but gentle touch. And Cole, when he came in for the midday meal, would notice the cabin smelling of pine needles instead of stale grease, and the way the light caught the loose strands of hair escaping Maggie's bun. He tried to ignore her. He tried to tell himself she was just a transient nuisance, a problem to be solved and sent away. But the cabin felt different with her in it. It felt less like a coffin and more like a home, and that terrified him. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the air hung heavy and still. The gray clouds had not brought rain, only a suffocating pressure. Cole came to the door, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I am riding up to the North Ridge," he said, "to check the waterhole. The lower creek is drying up." Maggie looked up from the table where she was peeling potatoes. "All right, you are coming with me," he said. Maggie blinked. "I am. I am not leaving you here alone," Cole said. "There are cougars in the foothills, and 2-legged predators that are worse. Besides, you need to see the land if you are going to understand what you are up against." Maggie hesitated, then nodded. She put down the knife. He saddled a mare for her, a gentle sorrel named Bess with a white blaze on her nose. Maggie mounted with some difficulty, her ribs still tender, but she settled into the saddle with a natural grace that Cole noted with a raised eyebrow. "You have ridden before," he commented as they set out. "My father kept horses," she said, keeping her eyes on the trail. "Before." They rode in silence for an hour, climbing steadily. The trail wound through narrow canyons where the red rock walls pressed in close, casting long, cool shadows. Scrub oak and juniper clung to the cliffs, their roots twisting into the stone like desperate fingers. It was a rugged, beautiful, lonely country. They crested a ridge and the world fell away beneath them. The valley sprawled out, a vast patchwork of brown and gray. To the east, Maggie could see the faint, dark smudge of Ash Hollow, and beyond it, the blackened scar of the prairie fire that had destroyed the stagecoach. Cole reined in Ghost and pointed. "That is the world," he said. "Big, isn't it?" "It is overwhelming," Maggie admitted. "The wind whipping her skirts, it makes you feel very small." "That is the point," Cole said. "Out here, you're small. The land doesn't care about your name, or your money, or your past. It only cares if you are strong enough to stand on it." Maggie looked at the distant town. "I do not think the people down there share the land's indifference. They care very much about names and pasts." Cole shifted in his saddle, leather creaking. He looked at her profile. She looked tired, her face thin, but there was a steel in her spine he hadn't expected. "You said a fire took everything from you," he said quietly. "What kind of fire?" Maggie stiffened. She looked at the horizon. "A house fire," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. 4 years ago, my parents died in it. My fiancé died trying to save them. Cole watched her. "And you survived." "I survived," she said bitterly. And because I survived, the town decided I must have caused it. They needed someone to blame. An accident is terrifying because it means God is capricious. But if a girl is careless, if a girl is cursed, that makes sense. That gives them a target for their anger. She turned to look at him, her blue eyes fierce. They said I knocked over a lantern. They said I was negligent. They screamed at me in the street while the ashes were still smoking. Cole felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. He knew that feeling. He knew the weight of eyes that looked at you and saw only a monster. I was a ranch hand in Kansas, he said, his voice low. 3 years ago, the owner was a hard man. He liked to burn out the homesteaders who got too close to his water. One night, a fire got away from him. A family died. I was there. I tried to stop it, but I was too late. He looked down at his hands, leather-gloved and scarred. When the sheriff came, the owner blamed me, said I was a drunk, said I set the fire in a rage. He had money. I had nothing. I had to run. I have been running ever since. Maggie stared at him. The silence between them shifted, changing texture. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but the silence of two soldiers recognizing the same uniform. They burned you too, she whispered. Cole pulled on the reins, turning his horse. We should keep moving, he said roughly. The waterhole is just ahead. They stopped at the Talbot Ranch on the way back. It was a necessity. Cole was low on flour and coffee, and the Talbots were the nearest neighbors. Only 4 miles from his cabin. The Talbot place was larger than Cole's, with a whitewashed house and a barn that leaned only slightly to the left. Mrs. Talbot was in the yard feeding chickens when they rode up. She was a severe woman with a face like a dried apple and eyes that missed nothing. She stopped scattering the grain as they approached, wiping her hands on her apron. Her gaze went instantly to Maggie. Mr. Harper, she said, nodding curtly. Mrs. Talbot. Cole tipped his hat. I was hoping to trade for some flour and coffee. I have some venison jerky and a few hides. Mrs. Talbot didn't look at the hides. She was staring at Maggie, her eyes narrowing. She took in the mended dress, the loose hair, the fact that she was riding alone with a single man. And who is this? Mrs. Talbot asked, her voice sharp as a tack. This is Miss Sterling, Cole said, his voice hardening slightly. She was on the stage that wrecked. I'm helping her get back on her feet. On the stage, Mrs. Talbot sniffed. I heard about that. Heard everyone died. Not everyone, Maggie said, finding her voice. Mrs. Talbot walked closer, peering up at Maggie. You look familiar, girl. Have you been through here before? Maggie's heart hammered against her ribs. No, she lied, her voice trembling slightly. I am from the east, Mrs. Talbot hummed, a sound of deep suspicion. Well, I suppose we can spare some flour. My husband is in the barn. Cole dismounted. Wait here, he told Maggie. He walked toward the barn. As he passed the chicken coop, he heard Mrs. Talbot whisper loudly to herself, though it was clearly meant for Maggie's ears. Living up there with him. No ring on her finger. Shameful. Just shameful. Maggie sat rigid on the horse, her face burning. She felt naked, exposed. The woman's judgment felt like a physical slap. Inside the barn, Mr. Talbot, a heavy-set man with a red face, was less subtle. So, you got yourself a woman. Cole, he grinned, leaning on a pitchfork. She's a passenger from the wreck. Talbot, Cole snapped, grabbing a sack of flour. Keep your mind out of the gutter. Talbot laughed. People are talking. Cole, they saw the smoke from the stage. They know you pulled someone out. Now folks are saying you are keeping a saloon girl up there. Or worse. Let them talk, Cole said, throwing a bundle of hides on the workbench. It is none of their business. Talbot shrugged. Maybe not. But Maddox and the Reverend Wallace are stirring things up, saying the fire is a sign, saying strangers bring trouble. You watch your back. Harper, that girl might be more trouble than she is worth. Cole grabbed the supplies and walked out without another word. His blood was boiling. He hated the town. He hated the small-mindedness, the gossip that spread faster than cholera. He mounted Ghost in one fluid motion, handing the sack of flour to Maggie. "Let us go," he said. They rode back to the cabin in a tense silence. Maggie could feel the anger radiating off him. She felt small and dirty. The shameful woman, Mrs. Talbot had named her. When they were back inside the cabin, the sun setting in a blood-red streak, Maggie couldn't hold it in. "I am sorry," she said to his back as he lit the lantern. Cole turned, his face tight. "For what? For bringing this on you?" she said. "I saw how she looked at me. I know what they are saying. I never meant to ruin your reputation." "My reputation?" Cole laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Margaret, my reputation was ruined the day I was born. I do not care what that old bat thinks." "You do care," Maggie countered. "I saw your face. You hate it. You hate being dragged into their stories." Cole slammed his hand down on the table, making the tin cups jump. "Yes, I hate it," he shouted. "I came here to be left alone, to live my life without having to answer to hypocrites who pray on Sunday and cheat their neighbors on Monday. And now, because of you, I am the center of their attention." Maggie flinched, stepping back, the words cut deep. "I will leave," she whispered. "I will go tomorrow. I will walk if I have to." Cole looked at her, seeing the hurt in her eyes. The anger drained out of him as quickly as it had come, leaving him tired. He rubbed his face with his hand. "No," he said, his voice rough. "You won't leave. Not like this. You will get killed out there." He turned away, staring into the dark corners of the room. We stay away from them. We stay here until you are ready." The weather turned 2 days later. It started with a stillness that was unnatural. The birds stopped singing. The cattle huddled together near the fence, their tails twitching. The sky turned a sickly yellow-brown, blotting out the sun. Cole was in the yard when he looked up and saw it. A wall of darkness moving across the valley floor. It wasn't rain, it was earth. "Dust storm!" he roared, dropping his hammer. "Maggie, close the shutters!" Maggie ran from the garden patch, her skirts flying. She grabbed the heavy wooden shutters, slamming them closed against the window frame and latching them tight. Cole was frantically herding the chickens into the coop. He grabbed the horses, leading them into the lean-to and barring the door. The wind hit them then. A sudden, violent shriek. "Get inside!" Cole yelled, grabbing Maggie's arm. They stumbled into the cabin, the wind tearing the door from Cole's grip and slamming it against the wall. He threw his shoulder against the wood, forcing it closed and dropping the heavy crossbar into place. The light was gone. Inside, it was as dark as midnight. The sound was deafening. Thousands of tiny stones hitting the walls. The wind howling like a banshee down the chimney. "Light the lamp," Cole ordered, his voice tight. Maggie fumbled with the matches, her hands shaking. She finally got the wick to catch. The yellow flame illuminated the small space, casting long, dancing shadows. Fine grit was already drifting through the cracks in the walls, coating everything in a thin layer of gray powder. They sat near the stove, the only source of warmth as the temperature plummeted. The cabin felt incredibly small. The world outside had ceased to exist. There was only this room, this light, and the two of them. Maggie hugged her knees, listening to the wind. "It sounds like it wants to tear the roof off." "It might try," Cole said grimly. "But this cabin has stood for 20 years. It is stubborn." He poured 2 cups of coffee, handing one to her. Their fingers brushed. The contact was electric, startling them both. They drank in silence for a while, the storm raging around them. "I have been thinking," Maggie said softly, staring into her cup, "about what I will do when I leave." Cole looked at her. "And I might go east," she said. "Maybe St. Louis or Chicago. Somewhere big, somewhere no one knows who Maggie Lane is." She slipped. She used her real name. Cole went still. "Maggie Lane," he repeated. Maggie looked up, realizing her mistake. She let out a shaky breath. "That is my name. Margaret Lane." Cole nodded slowly. He didn't ask for the rest of the story. He didn't need to. He just let the name hang in the air between them. "You think running to a city will fix it?" Cole asked. "I think disappearing might." She said, If I am no one, then I cannot be hurt. Cole swirled the coffee in his cup. It doesn't work that way. Maggie, you can run to the ocean. You can change your name 100 times, but you take yourself with you. The ghosts, they have long legs. They follow. He looked at her, his dark eyes intense. I tried to run. I came to the emptiest place I could find, and I still wake up smelling smoke. Maggie looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the lines of pain around his mouth, the exhaustion in his posture. She saw a man who was just as lonely, just as hunted as she was. And suddenly, the fear of the storm, the fear of the town, the fear of the past, it all receded. All that mattered was the heat of the stove and the man sitting 3 feet away. She reached out. It was an instinct, a magnetic pull she couldn't resist. She placed her hand on his forearm. His sleeve was rolled up, exposing the pale, scarred skin where a burn had healed badly years ago. Her fingers were cool against his warm flesh. You are not alone. Cole, she whispered. The touch sent a jolt through him that was stronger than lightning. He looked down at her hand, small and pale against his weathered skin. He felt a surge of desire so powerful it knocked the breath out of him. He wanted to grab her hand. He wanted to pull her out of that chair and onto his lap. He wanted to bury his face in her smoke-scented hair and forget everything else. But he couldn't. He was poison. He was ruin. If he touched her, really touched her, he would destroy her. His muscles went rigid. He stared at her, his eyes dark with conflict. Maggie's breath hitched. She leaned in slightly, her lips parting. The air between them crackled. Cole stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. I need to check the barn, he muttered, turning away from her. But the storm? Maggie stammered, her hand falling back to her lap. It is letting up. He lied. The wind was still howling. I need to check the horses. He grabbed his coat and unbarred the door. He slipped out into the maelstrom, slamming the door behind him, leaving Maggie alone in the sudden silence of the room. She sat there, stunned. Her face burned with humiliation. She had reached out, and he had run. She felt foolish, cheap, Mrs. Talbot was right, she thought bitterly. I am just a shameful woman imposing on a decent man, but beneath the shame, there was something else. She remembered the look in his eyes before he turned away. It wasn't disgust. It was hunger, and it was fear. That night, the wind finally died down. Cole didn't come back inside for 2 hours. When he did, he was covered in dust, his eyes red-rimmed. He went straight to his bedroll on the floor, mumbling a good night. Maggie lay on the cot, staring at the dark ceiling. She couldn't sleep. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Around midnight, she heard him. No, get out. The roof. Cole was talking in his sleep. His voice was a low, tormented murmur. Don't go back in. It's too hot. Sarah. No. Maggie lay still, her heart aching. Sarah. A name from his past. A name connected to the fire he couldn't stop. She realized then that they were mirrors of each other. She was the woman who was blamed for a fire. He was the man who blamed himself for one. They were both trapped in the same burning house, years after the flames had gone out. She rolled over, watching his dark shape on the floor. He was restless, thrashing slightly. She didn't go to him. She knew he wouldn't want that. But as she watched him fight his demons, a resolve hardened in her chest. She was done running. She was done hiding behind false names and false stories. Cole Harper had seen her at her worst, soot-stained and screaming, and he had saved her. He was trying to save her still, by keeping his distance, but she didn't want to be saved anymore. She wanted to be known. I am not a ghost, she thought fiercely, and neither are you. She closed her eyes, listening to the rhythm of his breathing as it slowly evened out. The decision was made. She would stay. She would face the town, and she would force this stubborn, broken cowboy to see her, not as a victim, but as the woman who could help him put out the fire in his own soul. The peace of the high plains was a deception. For 3 days, The wind had been gentle, and the sky had remained a startling, innocent blue, but the land held its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. It happened just after the midday meal. Cole was repairing a section of the corral fence, the rhythmic thud of his hammer echoing off the canyon walls. While Maggie scrubbed linens in a tin washtub near the porch, she straightened, wiping suds from her forehead with the back of her wrist, and froze. To the southeast, a dark stain was spreading across the sky. It was not the thin, wispy gray of a campfire. It was black, dense, and greasy. Cole dropped his hammer. He didn't say a word. He strode toward the lean-to where the horses were tethered. Maggie abandoned the laundry, her heart giving a painful lurch against her ribs. She ran to him as he threw a saddle onto Ghost's back. "That is the Peterson place," Cole said, his voice flat and hard. "It is close, too close. I am coming," Maggie said. Cole didn't argue. He saddled the mare. Bess with efficient, jerky movements. Minutes later, they were galloping out of the yard, the hooves of their mounts kicking up sprays of dry dust that mingled with the smell of wood smoke drifting on the wind. The ride took 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. As they crested the final rise, the devastation laid itself out before them. The Peterson homestead was a small operation, just a sod house and a timber barn built with years of back-breaking labor. Now, the barn was an inferno. The structure was fully engulfed, the flames roaring upward like a living thing, consuming dry hay and seasoned wood with terrifying speed. The heat hit them 50 yards out. Cole reined in, sliding off his horse before it came to a stop. Maggie scrambled down, her boots hitting the earth hard. The family was gathered near the water trough, a huddled mass of misery. John Peterson, a man Maggie knew vaguely from her childhood as a stoic, hard-working Swede, was on his knees, his face blackened with soot, coughing violently. His wife, Ilara, clutched their 2 small children to her skirts, her eyes wide and glassy with shock. A single milk cow bellowed from the safety of the garden patch, rolling its eyes in terror. The barn roof collapsed with a sound like a cannon shot. Sparks showered the sky, drifting dangerously toward the house. "Get buckets!" Cole roared, jolting John out of his stupor. "Wet the roof of the house, now!" Cole didn't wait. He grabbed a bucket from near the trough, plunged it into the water, and ran toward the house. John stumbled after him. Maggie stood frozen. The collapse of the barn roof had done it. That sound, the cracking of heavy timber, the rush of air. It punched through her defenses. Suddenly, she wasn't standing on the Peterson claim. She was standing on Main Street in Ash Hollow. 4 years ago, the bakery, the heat pressing against the windows until they shattered, her father's voice screaming for her mother, the smell. God, the smell. It wasn't just burning wood. It was the smell of grain, of leather, of animals. It was the smell of a life being turned into carbon. The world tilted. Gray spots danced in her vision. Her knees turned to water, and she swayed, the roar of the fire drowning out the cries of the Peterson children. Maggie. The voice was sharp, cutting through the haze. Strong hands gripped her shoulders, halting her fall. She gasped, looking up. Cole was there. He had abandoned the bucket line for a split second, seeing her falter. His face was streaked with ash, his eyes intense and searching. "Breathe," he commanded. "You are here. You are not there. Breathe." She leaned into him, unable to support her own weight. She pressed her forehead against the rough canvas of his coat, trembling violently. The smell of smoke on him was overpowering, but beneath it was the scent of the man, sweat, tobacco, and life. He held her tightly, his arm wrapping around her back, pulling her against his solid frame. It was a utilitarian embrace, meant to steady a fainting woman, but he held it too long. For 5 seconds, 10 seconds. He didn't let go. He shielded her body with his own, placing himself between her and the heat. I cannot breathe," she whispered. "Yes, you can," Cole said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "You are stronger than the fire. Look at me." She lifted her head. His dark eyes locked onto hers. anchoring her. Slowly, the spinning world steadied. A wagon rattled up the lane, followed by 2 riders, neighbors. The alarm had spread. Men jumped down, shouting orders, joining the bucket line to save the house. The commotion broke the moment between Cole and Maggie. He stepped back, his hand lingering on her arm for a fraction of a second before he turned back to the work. Maggie stood by the trough, trying to make herself useful by dipping rags in water for Mrs. Peterson. But she felt the eyes on her. The townsfolk who had arrived were a mix of ranchers and shopkeepers from the edge of Ash Hollow. They worked to douse the sparks on the house roof, but as the danger passed and the barn reduced itself to a smoldering pile of embers, the muttering began. "It is the curse," a man muttered, wiping his brow with a dirty handkerchief. "Just like the old days, fire comes out of nowhere." Maggie kept her head down, her bonnet pulled low, but she couldn't hide from Mrs. Gable. The old woman, a fixture of Ash Hollow who had known Maggie's mother, was squinting at her from the back of a buckboard wagon. "You there, Mrs.?" Gable called out, her voice cracking like dry parchment. "The girl with Harper. Turn around." Maggie froze. She slowly turned, keeping her face in the shadow of the bonnet. "I know that walk, Mrs.," Gable said, leaning forward. "You look mighty familiar. Child, who are your people?" "I'm just passing through," Maggie said, her voice shaking. "Passing through," the old woman scoffed. "You walk like a lane. I would know that stride anywhere." A silence fell over the group gathered by the trough. The name Lane hung in the air like smoke. Cole walked over, placing himself casually between Maggie and the wagon. "She is tired, Mrs. Gable," Cole said, his voice carrying a warning edge. "We all are. Let the girl be, Mrs." Gable held Cole's gaze for a moment, then sniffed. "Trouble follows trouble, Mr. Harper. You would do well to remember that." Cole took Maggie's elbow. "We are going," he said. "They didn't go back to the cabin. They needed lamp oil and grain, and the Peterson fire had made it clear that hiding was no longer an option. If rumors were going to fly, Cole reasoned, they might as well face them head on. They rode into Ash Hollow an hour later. The town had grown since Maggie had last seen it, but the bones were the same. The dust of Main Street was just as deep, the false fronts of the buildings just as weathered. The atmosphere was thick with tension. People stood in small knots on the boardwalks, speaking in hushed tones. When Cole and Maggie rode past, conversation stopped. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. They dismounted at the general store. Maggie felt like a criminal walking to the gallows. She kept her hand on her skirt to hide the trembling. Inside, the store smelled of pickles and sawdust. The proprietor, a balding man named Mr. Henderson, went still when they entered. He didn't offer a greeting. He just watched them approach the counter. "We need a tin of kerosene and a sack of oats," Cole said, placing a coin on the wood. Henderson took the money without touching Cole's hand. "Heard about the Peterson barn," he said, his eyes darting to Maggie. "Shame. Seems like the fires are waking up again." "Dry season," Cole said shortly. "Maybe," Henderson muttered. "Or maybe it is something else. Reverend Wallace is saying it is a judgment, says we have allowed sin to take root among us." Cole didn't reply. He grabbed the handle of the kerosene tin. "Come on." They walked out into the bright, harsh sunlight. Across the street, a small crowd had gathered near the white-clapboard church. The Reverend Wallace stood on the steps, a tall, gaunt man in a severe black coat. He was gesturing wildly, his voice carrying across the dusty street. "And the Lord sent fire to cleanse the wicked cities," he shouted. "He does not tolerate the unrepentant heart. When strangers bring their shadows into our valley, when the cursed return to the scene of their crimes, does not the land itself cry out?" He wasn't looking at the Bible in his hand. He was looking straight at Maggie. She stopped. The blood drained from her face. "Keep walking," Cole murmured, his hand hovering near the small of her back. "Do not give him the satisfaction." But Maggie couldn't move. She was staring past the church, down the street to a vacant lot nestled between the livery stable and the barber shop. It was an empty gap in the row of buildings, like a missing tooth. The foundation stones were still there, black and jagged. Weeds had grown up through the cracks, but the shape of the building that had once stood there was unmistakable. The Lane Bakery. Maggie walked toward it, drawn by a morbid gravity. Cole followed close behind, his eyes scanning the street for trouble. She stopped at the edge of the lot. A piece of charred timber still lay in the grass, half buried by 4 years of wind-blown dirt. Internal monologues screamed in her head. The lantern, the accusation. Thomas running back inside, her mother waving from the window, shouting for her to run. She did it. Someone had screamed that night. The baker's girl. She was careless with the oil. It wasn't true. She knew it wasn't true, but when 100 people scream a lie, it starts to sound like the voice of God. Is this it? Cole asked. His voice was quiet, stripped of judgment. He stood beside her, looking at the ruins. Maggie nodded, tears pricking her eyes. This is where it started? She whispered. My father's bakery? Cole looked at the blackened stones. And the fire. They said I knocked over a lantern in the storeroom, she said, her voice trembling with the weight of the confession. I didn't. I swear I didn't. I was out front sweeping the boardwalk, but the fire started in the back. By the time I smelled the smoke, the whole rear wall was gone. She turned to him, tears finally spilling over. My parents were inside. My fiancé, Thomas. He went in to get them. The roof came down. She took a ragged breath. The town needed a villain. Maddox, the big rancher. He was the first one to point the finger. He said he saw me running from the back alley. It was a lie. But he is a rich man, and I was just a girl. They called me a murderer. They ran me out. Cole listened, his jaw tightening until a muscle feathered in his cheek. He looked at the ruins, then up toward the hill where Jed Maddox's sprawling ranch house overlooked the town like a feudal castle. Maddox, Cole repeated. The name tasted like bile. He turned his gaze back to Maggie. He reached out, taking her gloved hand in his. He didn't care who was watching. I believe you, he said. Maggie looked at him, stunned. You do? Cole nodded. He looked around to ensure they weren't being overheard, then leaned in close. After the war, I drifted to Kansas, he said, his voice low and raspy. I worked for a man named Sterling, no relation to your alias. He wanted the water rights to a valley that was settled by 6 families. He tried to buy them out. They refused. Cole's eyes went dark, seeing a memory he tried to keep buried. One night, he told us to ride out. He said we were just going to scare them, but the men I rode with, they carried torches. I watched them set fire to a soddy. I tried to stop it. I fought one of my own crew, but the wind took it. He looked down at Maggie's hand in his. A woman and her child died that night. Sterling told the sheriff I did it, said I was a drunk drifter who went crazy. I have been running from that smoke for 3 years. Maggie squeezed his hand. The revelation hit her with physical force. They were the same, both marked by fire, both blamed for the sins of powerful men. We are both ghosts, she whispered. No, Cole said firmly. We are the only ones who are awake. Suddenly, a shout rang out from the end of the street. A teenage boy came sprinting around the corner, his face red with exertion. Fire! Fire at the south pasture! The street erupted into chaos. Men ran for their horses. Where is it? Someone shouted. Maddox's land, the boy yelled. But it is the lower section, near the creek, Maggie gasped. That is my land, she said. Or, it was. The deed I have. It is for the plot next to the bakery. But my father also had a small grazing lease on the South Creek. Cole's eyes narrowed. That is disputed land? Maddox has been trying to claim it for years, Maggie said, even before the fire. Cole moved instantly. Get to the horses. They rode hard to the south edge of town. The fire this time was in the grass, a line of orange eating its way through the dry sagebrush. It was smaller than the barn fire, but it was moving toward a line of cottonwoods that bordered the creek. Dozens of men were already there, beating at the flames with wet sacks and saddle blankets. Cole and Maggie joined the line. The heat was intense, searing their faces. Maggie wielded a heavy burlap sack, slamming it down on the creeping flames, putting all her anger and fear into every blow. Die, she thought. Die! Cole worked beside her, his movements precise and powerful. He wasn't just fighting the fire, he was studying it. He noticed the wind was blowing away from Maddox's main holdings. He noticed the fire had started in 3 distinct spots, moving in a line. Nature didn't work in straight lines. Within an hour, the fire was stamped out, leaving a black scar across the earth. The men stood panting, leaning on their knees. Jed Maddox rode up on a massive bay horse. He was a large man with silver hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He wore a fine suit that seemed out of place among the soot-stained workers. "Good work, boys," Maddox called out. "Drinks are on me at the saloon tonight." Cole stepped forward, wiping soot from his forehead. Lucky the wind was blowing south. "Maddox," Cole said, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. Maddox looked down at Cole, his eyes cold and flat. "Luck has nothing to do with it. Drifter, the Lord protects the righteous. Or perhaps the arsonist knows how to read a weather vane," Cole countered. The silence that followed was deafening. Maddox's face turned a shade of purple. "You watch your mouth. Harper," Maddox growled. "You are barely tolerated here. Do not push your luck. And you," he turned his gaze to Maggie, who stood by Cole's shoulder. "I see you have returned. Miss Lane, I would have thought you had enough sense to stay away." "I have a right to be here," Maggie said, her voice shaking but audible. Maddox laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "No one has rights they cannot defend." He turned his horse and rode away, his men trailing behind him. Cole watched him go. He saw the way Maddox's hand had hovered near his pistol. He saw the fear masked by arrogance. "He is afraid," Cole said softly. "Of what?" Maggie asked. "Of us," Cole said. "Because we know what smoke looks like when it is man-made." The ride back to the cabin was conducted in silence, but the air around them crackled with unspent energy. The adrenaline of the fire, the confrontation with Maddox, the shared confession, it all swirled together in a volatile mix. When they entered the cabin, the sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the floor. Cole slammed the door shut and barred it. He began to pace, his boots loud on the wood. "We need to leave," he said abruptly. Maggie looked up from the table where she was unpinning her hat. "What? They know who you are," Cole said, turning to her. "Maddox knows. Wallace knows. They are going to come for us. Maggie, they will use these fires as an excuse to hang us or shoot us. We need to pack. We can be in Wyoming in 3 days." "No," Maggie said. Cole stopped pacing. "What did you say?" "I said no," Maggie repeated. She stood up, her hands balling into fists. "I am not running again. I ran for 4 years. It did not help. It just made me tired." "You do not understand," Cole snapped, his voice rising. "These men are not just bullies. They are killers. I have seen what men like Maddox do to people who stand in their way. You are a target. Maggie, you are the face they attach their fear to." "And what about you?" Maggie shouted back. "You think you are protecting me? You are just as scared as I am. I am not scared for myself," Cole roared, stepping closer to her. "I am scared for you. I bring ruin. Maggie, everywhere I go, smoke follows. I am the one people whisper about in saloons. I am the dangerous drifter, the bad luck charm. If you stay with me, you will burn." They stood chest to chest, breathing hard. The anger was a shield, a way to keep the terrifying reality at bay. But the shield was cracking. "You think you are poison," Maggie said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "You think you are broken." "I am broken," Cole rasped. Maggie took a step closer, invading his space. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears and defiance. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about it," she said. "About what?" "About the stagecoach." She said, "About the way you pulled me out. About the creek. About how your hands shook when you washed the soot off my face." Cole flinched. "Don't. I have to," she insisted. "You stood between me and the fire today. You stood between me and the town. You are not ruin. Cole, you are the only safe place I have ever known. She reached out, grabbing the lapels of his coat. Do not keep your distance, she begged, her voice breaking. Do not treat me like I am fragile, and do not treat me like I am a mistake. Touch me. Cole, please. Cole looked down at her. He saw the soot on her cheek, the fire in her eyes, the desperate, beautiful need in her face. He had spent years building walls. He had spent years telling himself he didn't deserve softness, or warmth, or love. He told himself he was a creature of ash, but looking at her, the walls crumbled. God help me, he whispered. He grabbed her, his hands tangled in her hair, pulling her face to his. He kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It was full of grit and smoke and years of loneliness crashing together. It was fierce and desperate, acclaiming. Maggie made a sound in her throat, a sob of relief, and wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, trying to merge her body with his. Cole groaned, backing her up until she hit the wall. He pressed his body against hers, the contact searing. He wanted to consume her. He wanted to protect her. He wanted to stay in this moment forever. For a long minute, there was nothing but the sound of their breathing and the desperate movement of their lips. It was a kiss that tasted of danger and salvation. Then, Cole pulled back. He rested his forehead against hers, his chest heaving. His hands were cupped around her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. I want you, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. I want you more than is wise. I lie awake at night listening to you breathe, fighting the urge to cross the room. Maggie kept her eyes closed, savoring the confession. Then why did you stop? Because I will ruin you, he said, the old fear creeping back in. Maggie opened her eyes. She reached up, tracing the scar on his neck. You cannot ruin what is already burned, she said softly. We are both scorched, Cole. But maybe things can grow in the ash. Cole looked at her. He saw the truth in her eyes. She wasn't asking for a savior. She was asking for a partner. He let out a long, shaky breath. I won't let you face this alone, he vowed. I don't know how we win this, Maggie, but I won't run, and I won't let them take you. Maggie smiled. A small, sad, hopeful thing. That is all I need. Cole took her hand, interlacing their fingers. His grip was tight, possessive. Come here, he said gently. He led her out the door to the small porch. The night had fully fallen. The wind had died down, leaving a heavy silence over the valley. They stood side by side, looking south. On the horizon, a faint orange glow pulsed against the black sky. Another fire, another warning. It wasn't over. Maddox was still out there. The town still hated them. The danger was closer than ever. But as Cole squeezed her hand, and Maggie leaned her head against his shoulder, the fire on the horizon didn't look like an ending anymore. It looked like a signal fire, a challenge. They stood there in the dark, two scarred people holding hands on the edge of a war, deciding that if they were going to burn, they would burn together, and they would make sure the light of it exposed every lie in Ash Hollow. The weeks that followed brought no rain, only a sun that glared down like a feverish eye and a wind that scraped the nerves raw. The fires were no longer isolated tragedies. They were a plague. A hay barn would go up in a sheet of orange flame on a Tuesday. By Thursday, a smokehouse 3 miles away would be reduced to a skeleton of black timber. Fear changed the shape of Ash Hollow. It hardened faces and locked doors. The easy hospitality of the frontier, where a pot of coffee was always on the stove for a traveler, evaporated. In its place grew a thorny thicket of suspicion. Every stranger was a potential arsonist. Every drifting shadow was a threat. And at the center of this storm of paranoia sat the cabin beneath the limestone bluff. And the two people trying to hold back the dark, Cole Harper and Maggie Lane, rode into the teeth of this hostility day after day. They had stopped hiding. They rode side by side, Cole's shotgun resting conspicuously across his saddle horn. Maggie sitting tall on the mare, her chin lifted against the whispers. The whispers were getting louder. She is the one. Men muttered as they passed the livery stable. "The fire follows her." It always has. One afternoon, as Cole tied Ghost to the hitching rail outside the dry goods store, a ranch hand spat a stream of tobacco juice that landed inches from Cole's boot. Cole paused. He didn't look down. He looked straight at the man, his eyes dark and empty of fear. The ranch hand held the gaze for a heartbeat, then looked away, shuffling off toward the saloon. "They are terrified," Maggie said quietly, standing beside him. "Terrified men are dangerous," Cole replied, his voice low. "They stop thinking and start biting. They weren't just coming to town for supplies anymore. They were hunting for the truth." Over the past week, they had visited 4 different homesteads, families who lived on the ragged edges of Jed Maddox's sprawling empire. The stories were always the same, like verses in a hymnal of greed. First came the offer to buy the land, usually for pennies on the dollar, delivered by Maddox's foreman with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Then came the refusal. Then came the accidents, cut fences, poisoned water troughs, spooked cattle, and finally, the fire. It was a pattern so clear it could be drawn on a map. Yet the town refused to see it. They preferred the story of the cursed girl to the story of the greedy cattleman. It was easier to blame a woman than to challenge a king. Late that afternoon, Maggie found herself walking behind the livery stable while Cole negotiated for grain inside. She needed a moment of silence, away from the hostile stares of Main Street. The alley was shadowed and smelled of wet straw and manure. An old man was sitting on an overturned crate, mending a bridle. He was thin as a rail, his knuckles swollen with arthritis, his white hair standing up in tufts. Maggie stopped. She knew him, or she had known him, a lifetime ago. "Eli?" she whispered. The old man looked up, squinting through cloudy eyes. He froze. The bridle slipped from his hands and fell into the dust. "Miss Margaret?" he croaked. It was the first time anyone in town had used her name without spitting it. "Hello?" "Eli," Maggie said, stepping closer. "I didn't know you were still working the stables." The old man struggled to his feet, taking off his battered hat. He looked at her with an expression that broke Maggie's heart. It was pure, unadulterated terror. "You shouldn't be here." "Miss," he whispered, looking frantically toward the street. "Maddox, he has eyes everywhere." "I know," Maggie said, gentle. "I am not afraid of him." "Eli." "You should be," Eli said, his voice trembling. "You really should be." He took a step closer, lowering his voice until it was barely audible over the wind. "I saw you," he said, "the other day, by the old bakery lot. I saw you crying." Maggie nodded. "It is hard to look at." Eli swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his scrawny neck. He looked like a man trying to hold back a flood. "I have not slept right in 4 years." He confessed, the words rushing out, "Not a single night." "Why?" "Eli, because I was there," he whispered. "That night, I was sleeping in the loft of the stable next door. The heat, it woke me up." Maggie went still. "You saw the fire start?" "I saw men," Eli said, tears pooling in his rheumy eyes. "2 of them. They were in the alley behind your father's storeroom. They were carrying metal canisters." Maggie stopped breathing. "Canisters?" "It smelled like lamp oil," Eli said, "strong enough to make you gag." They poured it on the back wall. Then one of them struck a match. Maggie felt the ground sway beneath her boots. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a lantern she had carelessly knocked over. It was murder. "Who were they?" "Eli?" she demanded, gripping his arm. "Who were the men? I didn't see their faces." Eli sobbed. "They had bandanas up, but I saw the horses they rode away on. Big bays, branded with the double M. Maddox." "Why didn't you say anything?" Maggie asked, her voice cracking. "Why did you let them blame me? Why did you let me think I killed my own family?" Eli hung his head, shame radiating off him in waves. "I was afraid. Miss Margaret, Maddox owns this town. And the Reverend? He said it was God's will. He said questioning it was a sin. I am just a stable boy. Who would listen to me?" He looked up at her, begging for a forgiveness she wasn't sure she had the strength to give. "I am sorry." He wept. "I am so sorry." Maggie stared at him. She saw a pathetic, broken old man who had traded the truth for safety. She wanted to scream at him. She wanted to shake him until his teeth rattled. But beneath the anger, something massive and heavy in her chest was cracking. The weight she had carried for 4 years, the crushing, suffocating belief that she was poison, that she was careless, that she was a monster. It shattered. It wasn't me. She breathed. She turned and ran. She ran out of the alley, past the startled horses, past Cole, who was just coming out of the livery. "Maggie!" Cole shouted. She didn't stop. She couldn't be in this town. She couldn't be near these people who had lied to her and destroyed her. She mounted Bess in a scramble of skirts and kicked the mare into a gallop, riding hard for the open prairie. Cole found her 2 miles out of town, in a small grove of cottonwoods near the dry creek bed. The trees offered a sliver of shade in the vast, exposed landscape. She was on the ground, kneeling in the dirt, her forehead pressed against the rough bark of a tree. She was sobbing, great, heaving sounds that seemed to be tearing her apart from the inside. Cole dismounted and ran to her. He thought she was hurt. He thought someone had attacked her. "Maggie!" He dropped to his knees, grabbing her shoulders. "What happened? Talk to me." She turned into him, burying her face in his coat. She clung to him with a strength that startled him. "It wasn't me," she choked out. "Cole, it wasn't me." Cole held her, confused but steady. "What wasn't you? The fire," she sobbed. "The bakery. Eli saw them. He saw Maddox's men. They poured oil. They set it. They killed them. Cole, they killed my mother and father and Thomas, and they let me believe it was my fault." The revelation hit Cole like a physical blow. He looked over her head at the gray horizon, his eyes hardening into flint. He had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed was different. It meant that the cruelty Maggie had endured wasn't just mob mentality. It was a calculated orchestration. He wrapped his arms tighter around her, pulling her completely into his lap. He rocked her, stroking her hair as she wept out 4 years of accumulated poison. "Shh," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. I know. He held her while the sun began to dip lower in the sky. He held her until the sobbing turned to hiccups, and the hiccups turned to a heavy, exhausted silence. "You were never the monster," Cole said softly, his lips brushing her temple. "You were just the scapegoat." Maggie pulled back slightly, looking up at him. Her face was swollen, her eyes red, but there was a clarity in them he had never seen before. The haunted look was gone, replaced by a fierce, burning anger. "I hated myself," she whispered. "Every day, I looked in the mirror and saw a killer. And they knew. Maddox knew. Wallace knew. We will make them pay," Cole promised, his voice dark. "Every single one of them." Maggie looked at him. She saw the lethal intent in his eyes, the way his jaw was set, but she also saw the tenderness he reserved only for her. She realized then that she didn't want to talk about revenge. Not right now. She had spent 4 years dying inside. She wanted to live. She wanted to feel something other than grief and rage. She wanted to reclaim the body that the town had told her was cursed. "Take me home," she whispered. Cole looked at her, searching her face. "To the cabin." "Home," she repeated, the word heavy with meaning. The ride back was silent, but the air between them was charged. The sun set as they reached the cabin, painting the sky in violent shades of violet and red. Cole took care of the horses while Maggie went inside to light the stove. When he entered, the cabin was warm. The lamp cast a golden circle of light against the encroaching dark. Maggie was standing by the table. She had taken off her bonnet and washed her face. She looked pale, but steady. Cole barred the door. He turned to face her, removing his coat and hat. He felt a tension in his chest that had nothing to do with the danger outside. It was the way she was looking at him, like she was seeing him for the first time without the filter of her own guilt. Maggie walked around the table. She stopped 2 feet from him. "Cole," she said. He stood still, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "I'm here." She reached out and took his hands. His palms were rough, calloused from years of hard labor, scarred from barbed wire and fire. She ran her thumbs over his knuckles. You told me once that you bring ruin, she said softly. That you are broken. I am. Cole said, No. Maggie shook her head. You are not. You are the only thing in this world that has ever held me together. She stepped closer, closing the gap. She placed her hands flat against his chest, feeling the warmth of him through his shirt. I don't want to be afraid anymore, she whispered. Not of the fire, not of the town, and not of this. Cole looked down at her. He saw the invitation in her eyes, clear and undeniable. It wasn't the desperate plea of the woman in the stagecoach. It was the deliberate choice of a woman claiming what she wanted. He raised his hand, tracing the line of her jaw. His fingers trembled slightly. Maggie, he breathed. I am not a gentleman. I don't need gentle, she said fiercely. I need real. She rose on her tiptoes and kissed him. The kiss broke the dam. Cole made a low sound in his throat and wrapped his arms around her waist, lifting her off her feet. He carried her to the cot in the corner, the only soft place in a hard world. He laid her down, his body covering hers, shielding her from the shadows. The intimacy that followed was a revelation. It was a desperate, hungry tangle of limbs and breath, driven by the knowledge that the world outside wanted to destroy them. Cole stripped away her dress, his hands shaking as he navigated buttons and laces. When his fingers grazed the burn scar on her left arm, the mark from the stagecoach wreck, he didn't look away. He lowered his head and kissed the puckered skin. A benediction. Maggie gasped, arching into him. She ran her hands over his back, feeling the ridges of old scars, the map of his pain. She kissed the jagged line on his neck where the saber had cut him. There was no shame in the room. There was only the creak of the rope frame beneath them, the sound of the wind rattling the shutters, and the whispered names that sounded like prayers. Cole, Maggie. It was a reclaiming. With every touch, they were scrubbing away the labels the world had put on them. Cursed, drifter, murderer, failure. Here, in the dark, they were just a man and a woman, finding a way to be whole. Later, much later, the cabin was quiet. The fire in the stove had burned down to glowing coals. Maggie lay with her head on Cole's chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. His arm was draped over her, heavy and protective. She traced circles on his skin with her fingertip. Cole? She whispered. His voice was deep, rumbling in his chest. If we survive this, she said, what happens? Cole was silent for a long moment. He stared up at the ceiling beams. He had never allowed himself to think about a after. Survival had always been a day-to-day proposition. I don't know, he admitted. I have spent a long time just trying to stay ahead of the smoke. Me too, Maggie said. But I am tired of running. Cole tightened his arm around her. There is a valley in Wyoming, he said quietly. I rode through it once, years ago. High up, green grass, good water. It is quiet there. Maggie smiled against his skin. Is there a town? No, Cole said. Just mountains and sky. It sounds lonely, Maggie said. Cole turned his head, kissing the top of her hair. Not if you are there. The words hung in the air, a promise he hadn't meant to make but couldn't take back. He realized with a jolt of terror that he had started to imagine a home, not just a shelter, but a home. And that made the danger waiting outside the door infinitely more terrifying. The morning sun brought no mercy. It was bright and cold, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the cabin air. They were drinking coffee, the intimacy of the night before lingering in the way they moved around each other, a brush of shoulders, a shared look. When the sound of hoofbeats shattered the peace, many horses, coming fast. Cole was at the window in a second, his shotgun in his hands. Damn, he swore. What is it? Maggie asked, grabbing her shawl. It is a posse, Cole said grimly. Maddox, Wallace, and half the town. He turned to her, his face hard. Stay inside. No, Maggie said, grabbing his arm. We do this together, remember? Cole looked at her, saw the set of her jaw, and nodded. He unbarred the door. They stepped out onto the porch just as the riders reined in. There were 12 of them. Jed Maddox sat at the front on his bay horse, looking like a king coming to pass sentence. Reverend Wallace was beside him, clutching a Bible like a weapon. Behind them were men Maggie recognized, shopkeepers, ranch hands, faces that had once smiled at her in her father's bakery. Now, they looked like a lynch mob. "Cole Harper," Maddox shouted, his voice booming. "Step away from the woman." Cole didn't move. He held the shotgun loose in one hand, the barrel pointed at the ground but ready to rise. "Get off my land." "Maddox," Cole said calmly. "You are trespassing. We are here on the Lord's business." Reverend Wallace shrieked, his face red. "We are here to root out the corruption that plagues this valley. We have a witness, Harper," Maddox said, leaning forward on his saddle horn. "A man who saw you riding near the Peterson place 10 minutes before the fire started." "That is a lie," Cole said. "We were here. Lies flow easily from the tongues of the wicked," Wallace shouted. He pointed a shaking finger at Maggie. "And you, the Jezebel who brings the flame. We know what goes on in this cabin. We know the sin you wallow in." The crowd murmured, an ugly, angry sound. "You are living in filth," Wallace continued, his eyes bulging. "An unmarried woman laying with a drifter. It is an abomination. It is your immorality that calls the fire down upon us." Maggie felt the blood drain from her face. She felt exposed, dirty. The beautiful, sacred thing she and Cole had shared the night before was being twisted into something ugly by this fanatic. Cole stepped forward, the shotgun rising slightly. "You speak about her again, Wallace, and you will meet your maker sooner than you planned," Cole said, his voice ice cold. Maddox drew his pistol. "Don't be a fool. Harper, there are 12 of us. You cannot kill us all. We are taking you both in. For arson. And for public indecency." "I am not going anywhere with you," Cole said. "And neither is she." The tension stretched tight as a bowstring. Fingers hovered over triggers. The horses danced nervously. Violence was a heartbeat away. "Wait!" The voice came from the back of the group. A buckboard wagon had pulled up behind the posse. "Mrs." Talbot stood up in the wagon bed, clutching her shawl. "Mrs. Talbot." Maddox frowned, turning in his saddle. "Go home, woman. This is men's work. I will not—" "Mrs." Talbot said, her voice shaking but loud. "I have something to say." She looked at Cole, then at Maggie. She looked at the shotgun. Then she looked at Maddox. "Mr. Harper did not set the fire at the Peterson place." She said, "How do you know that?" Maddox demanded. "Because I saw who did." She lied. Or maybe it wasn't a lie. Her eyes were defiant. "I was up late with a sick calf. I saw 2 riders skirting the ridge near Peterson's barn. They were heading south, away from Harper's land. They were strangers." Maddox's eyes narrowed. "You are mistaken. Mrs. Talbot, I know what I saw. Jed Maddox," she snapped. "And I saw Mr. Harper chopping wood in his yard at that exact time. I can see his cabin from my porch. He was nowhere near that fire." A murmur went through the posse. Mrs. Talbot was a pillar of the community. Her word held weight that Cole's did not. The witness must have been confused. A man in the back muttered. Maddox looked furious. He glared at Mrs. Talbot, a silent promise of retribution in his eyes. Then he turned back to Cole. "This changes nothing," he spat. "The fires are still burning, and you two are still the cause." He holstered his gun, but kept his hand on the grip. "We will be watching you, Harper, day and night. One wrong move, one spark, and we will hang you from the nearest cottonwood. And her beside you." Maddox wheeled his horse around. "Let's go," he shouted to the men. Wallace lingered for a moment, his eyes burning with hatred. "God is watching," he hissed at Maggie. Then he turned and followed the posse. Mrs. Talbot stayed for a moment. She looked at Maggie. There was no warmth in her gaze, but there was a begrudging respect, or perhaps just a shared dislike of Maddox. She nodded once, sat down, and slapped the reins, turning her wagon around. Cole watched them go until the dust settled. Then he lowered the shotgun and turned to Maggie. His face was pale, his eyes wild. "That was too close," he said. "We are safe for now," Maggie said. letting out a breath she felt she had been holding for an hour. "Safe?" Cole threw the shotgun onto the porch bench. "Safe? Did you hear him? They are going to hang us." "Maggie, Mrs. Talbot bought us a day, maybe 2, but they will come back. And next time they won't bring a preacher. They will bring a rope." He grabbed her shoulders. "You have to leave. Tonight. I can put you on Bess. You can cut through the mountains to the railhead in Laramie." "No," Maggie said, pulling away. "Maggie, listen to me," Cole shouted. "This isn't a game. They want blood. My blood. If you are standing next to me, it will be yours too." "Then so be it," Maggie shouted back. Cole raked his hands through his hair, pacing the yard. "I cannot protect you against a whole town. I love you too much to watch you swing for a crime you didn't commit." Maggie froze. The words hung in the air. "I love you." He stopped pacing. He looked at her, realizing what he had said. "You love me," she whispered. Cole looked defeated. "Yes," he said, his voice cracking. "God help me, I do. And that is why you have to go, because I am going to die here. Maggie, I am going to die defending this patch of dirt because it is all I have. But you can have a life." Maggie walked up to him. She took his face in her hands. "You are not just a patch of dirt to me, Cole. You are my life. I am not leaving. I am not running. We are going to fight them." "With what?" Cole asked desperately. 2 guns against 20. "With the truth," Maggie said. "Eli knows. There might be others. We have to find proof." "It is suicide," Cole whispered. "Maybe," Maggie said. "But I would rather die standing with you than live running without you." Cole closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against hers. He was shaking. The fear of losing her was greater than the fear of the fire. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." The sun went down, casting the valley in shadow. The wind picked up again, cold and biting. Maggie stepped out onto the porch, wrapping her shawl tight. She looked up at the stars, hard and bright diamonds in the black void. She felt the weight of the revolver Cole had insisted she carry in her pocket. They were running out of time. Maddox would not wait. Wallace would not wait. The next fire would be the last one. She looked at the dark hills, knowing the enemy was out there. Watching. She touched her stomach, feeling a phantom flutter of nerves. "We have to be faster than the flames," she thought. "We have to be brighter." She turned back to the door, where Cole was waiting in the yellow light of the lamp. She stepped inside, closing the door against the wind, ready to face whatever morning brought. The sky turned the color of a bruised plum, heavy and swollen with a violence that had been building for weeks. There was no rain in the clouds, only the dry, static charge of a summer storm that promised nothing but destruction. The wind picked up, howling through the canyons like a choir of ghosts, whipping the sagebrush until it lay flat against the parched earth. Cole Harper stood on the porch of the cabin, his eyes scanning the horizon. He smelled the ozone before he saw the flash. A bolt of dry lightning, jagged and white-hot, stabbed the earth on the northern ridge. Then another, striking the valley floor to the east, and a third, hammering the dry timber near the creek. "It begins," Cole said, his voice flat. Maggie Lane stood beside him, clutching her shawl against the wind. She watched as thin ribbons of smoke began to curl up from the strike points. In the distance, the ribbons widened, turning into angry columns of orange and black. The grass, cured to the consistency of tinder by the long drought, caught instantly. "It is too much," Maggie whispered. "The wind is driving it straight toward the town." Cole narrowed his eyes. He was watching the smoke, reading it as he would read a trail. The lightning strikes were natural, random, but then he saw it. A 4th plume of smoke rising from a cluster of haystacks on the southern edge of Ash Hollow, miles from where the lightning had touched down. "That one is not nature," Cole growled, pointing. "That is a torch." "Someone is setting fires?" Maggie asked, horror dawning on her face. "Now, in the middle of a storm, chaos is a ladder," Cole said grimly. He turned and grabbed his saddlebags. "Someone figures the lightning will cover their tracks. They are going to burn the town and blame the sky. Or us." He looked at her. "We cannot stay here. If the wind shifts, this canyon becomes a chimney. And those people down there, they are going to need help. They hate us. Cole, Maggie said, though she was already moving to get her boots. They want to hang us. Then we will make it hard for them to do it while they are busy putting out a fire. Cole said, "Get the horses." By the time they reached the outskirts of Ash Hollow, the world had ended. The wind was a physical force, tearing shingles from roofs and driving grit into eyes and teeth. To the north and east, the horizon was a wall of flame, a roaring monster that ate the oxygen out of the air. But the immediate danger was the fire on the south edge, the one Cole had spotted. It had jumped from the haystacks to a row of wooden shanties and was now licking at the back of the livery stable. The church bell was ringing frantically, a discordant clang that sounded like a scream. People poured into the streets, their face-twisted masks of terror. Men ran with buckets. Women dragged trunks of linens into the dusty road. Children wailed, clinging to skirts. At the center of the panic stood Reverend Wallace. He had climbed onto a water trough in the middle of Main Street, his black coat flapping like the wings of a crow. "Repent!" he shrieked, pointing a long, bony finger at the encroaching flames. "The Lord has sent his seraphim to purge the wicked. This is the judgment for the sin we have harbored." He saw Cole and Maggie riding in, their horses dancing nervously in the smoke. Wallace's eyes lit up with a fanatic zeal. "There!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the roar of the fire. "The harbingers of doom! The harlot and the murderer! They bring the hellfire with them. Cast them out, and the Lord may yet spare us." A few men stopped their bucket lines, looking at Cole with wild, frightened eyes. A rock sailed through the air, striking the flank of Cole's horse. Ghost reared, and Cole fought to bring him down. Cole drew his shotgun, not pointing it at the crowd, but holding it high. "You are listening to a fool while your houses burn," Cole roared. His voice was a thunderclap, honed on battlefields and cattle drives. It stopped the crowd in its tracks. "The fire does not care about your sins," Cole shouted. "It cares about wind and fuel. If you want to save this town, stop praying and start digging." He holstered the gun and spurred his horse toward the livery stable, where the flames were threatening to ignite the roof. Maggie did not hesitate. She rode straight to a group of paralyzed women near the mercantile. "Get wet blankets," she ordered, her voice cracking with smoke but ringing with authority. "Soak them in the horse trough. We need to cover the roofs of the store and the hotel. Move." Stunned by her command, the women moved. The paralysis broke. For the next 2 hours, there was no politics in Ash Hollow. There was only the war against the fire. Cole worked like a man possessed. He organized a bucket brigade from the town well, shouting rhythmically to keep the water moving. He took an axe and chopped down a burning fence that connected a shed to the main bank building, creating a firebreak that saved the structure. Maggie was everywhere. She wrapped her face in a wet bandana and led terrified horses out of the smoke-filled livery. She helped Mrs. Higgins, the dressmaker, drag her sewing machine into the street. She beat at the grass fires with a wet sack until her arms screamed in protest. The townspeople worked alongside them, too desperate to hate. When a burning beam collapsed near the blacksmith, it was Cole who shoved the smith out of the way. When a child wandered too close to the sparks, it was Maggie who scooped him up and carried him to his mother. But the fire was relentless. It seemed to have a mind of its own, jumping gaps that should have stopped it. Cole paused to wipe the soot from his eyes. He was standing near the alley behind the general store. The wind was blowing hard from the north now, pushing the main fire away from the town center. They were winning. Then, he saw it. 2 streets over, near the warehouses that stored the winter grain. A flicker of light appeared. It wasn't a spark from the sky. It came from inside the building. The warehouse belonged to a man who had refused to sell to Jed Maddox 3 months ago. Cole watched as a side door kicked open. A man slipped out, coughing, clutching an empty kerosene can. He wore a yellow bandana over his face, but Cole recognized the hat. It was a distinctive, wide-brimmed Stetson with a silver band. It belonged to a man named Silas Heavy, one of Maddox's top enforcers. Cole didn't think. He didn't weigh the odds. He dropped his axe and ran. He sprinted across the vacant lot, leaping over a pile of lumber. The arsonist saw him coming and fumbled for his gun, but he was too slow. Cole hit him at a dead run. They went down in a tangle of limbs, rolling in the dirt and ash. The kerosene can clattered away. Silas was big, but Cole was fighting with the fury of a man who had been pushed to the edge of the world. He slammed a fist into Silas's jaw, knocking the gun from his hand. Silas bucked, throwing Cole off, and scrambled to his feet, pulling a knife from his belt. "You should have kept riding." "Harper," Silas hissed, "you are dead." The warehouse behind them erupted. The windows blew out, showering them with glass. The heat was blistering. Cole dodged the knife thrust, stepping inside the arc. He grabbed Silas's wrist, twisting it violently until the bone snapped with a sickening crack. Silas screamed, dropping the knife. Cole kicked his legs out from under him and pinned him to the ground, his forearm pressing against the man's throat. "Why?" Cole shouted, leaning his weight into the chokehold. "The town is already burning." "Why set another one?" Silas sputtered, his face turning purple. "Maddox," he said. "Insurance. The grain." Cole eased the pressure slightly. "Say it again, loud enough for God to hear." "Maddox," Silas gasped, terrified by the fire raging 10 feet away. He wanted the grain destroyed, said to blame the lightning, said if the town burned, he could buy the lots for dirt. "Maggie," Cole yelled, not looking away from his prisoner. She was there. She had seen the fight and run toward them, her dress torn, her face blackened with soot. She stood over them, looking at the man on the ground. She recognized him. He was one of the men who had laughed at her when she walked down Main Street. "Get him up," Maggie said, her voice cold as steel. Cole hauled Silas to his feet, twisting the broken arm behind his back. The man whimpered. "Walk," Cole commanded. They marched him to the center of Main Street. The bucket brigade had paused, exhausted. The fire on the edge of town was contained, smoldering in the damp earth where they had soaked it. The crowd was gathered near the church, coughing and huddled together. Maddox was there, sitting on his horse, looking pristine and untouched by the soot. Reverend Wallace was beside him. "Look at the heroes," Wallace sneered as Cole and Maggie approached, "playing firemen after they lit the match." "Listen to me," Maggie screamed. Her voice was not the polite whisper of a lady. It was a raw, guttural cry that tore through her throat. It silenced the crowd. She shoved Silas forward, so hard he stumbled and fell to his knees in the dust. "Tell them," Maggie commanded. "Tell them what you told us." Silas looked up at Maddox. He saw the cold promise of death in his boss's eyes. But then he looked at the fire still consuming the warehouse. And he looked at Cole Harper, who looked ready to kill him with his bare hands. "It was Maddox," Silas shouted, his voice cracking. "He told me to light the warehouse. He told us to light the haystacks." A gasp went through the crowd. "Lies!" Maddox roared, his hand dropping to his pistol. "The man is delirious from the smoke. Harper has bewitched him. He promised us a bonus," Silas babbled, desperate now. "He said if we burned the holdouts, he could claim the land. He has been doing it for years. He is lying," Wallace shouted, stepping forward. "Do not listen to the serpent. You listen to me." Maggie stepped into the light of the fire. She pulled the bonnet from her head, letting her hair fall loose. She looked at the faces of the people who had shunned her. 4 years ago. "A bakery burned on this street," she yelled. "You said I did it. You said I was careless. You ran me out of my home." She pointed a shaking finger at the ruins down the street. "Why did the fire move so fast? Why did the alley smell of oil? Why did none of you ask questions?" Because it was easier to blame a girl than to face him. She pointed at Maddox. "He killed my father." She took a step toward the crowd. "He killed my mother. He killed the man I was going to marry, and you let him do it because you were afraid." Silence. Absolute, heavy silence. Then, a movement from the shadow of the livery stable. Eli, the old stable hand, stepped into the light. He was shaking, clutching his hat in his hands. He looked at Maddox, then at Maggie. "She is right," Eli said. His voice was quiet, but in the silence, it carried. "Shut your mouth, old man," Maddox warned, his voice low and dangerous. "I won't," Eli said. "I am done being quiet. He turned to the crowd. "I saw them. 4 years ago. I saw Maddox's men pour oil on the back of the Lane Bakery. I saw them light it." He looked at Reverend Wallace. "And I told you, Reverend, 2 days later in confession, I told you what I saw, and you told me to be silent. You said it was God's will that the lanes were removed." The crowd turned to look at the preacher. Wallace turned pale, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. You misunderstood," he stammered. "I sought to keep the peace. You sought to keep your pockets full of Maddox's donations." A shopkeeper shouted from the back. The mood shifted instantly. The fear that had held the town in check evaporated, replaced by a white-hot fury. The people looked at the burning warehouse, then at the burning homes, and finally at the man on the horse who had orchestrated it all. "Get him!" someone yelled. Maddox pulled his gun. He fired a shot into the air. "Back!" he screamed. "I will kill the first man who steps forward." His horse reared. He looked around, realizing he had lost. The fire he had used as a weapon had finally turned to burn him. He wheeled his horse around and galloped toward the bank building, his office. "He is going for the deeds," Cole shouted. "If he destroys the records, we cannot prove the land grabs." Cole ran for his horse, but Ghost was too far away. He started running on foot. Maggie was right beside him. They chased Maddox down the street. Maddox reached the bank, jumped from his horse, and ran inside. "He is going to burn it," Cole panted as they reached the steps. He would rather burn the whole town than go to jail. They burst through the doors. The bank was empty, the clerks having fled hours ago. Smoke was already billowing from the back office. Maddox had wasted no time. Cole kicked the office door open. Maddox was standing over a metal safe, stuffing ledgers and papers into a trash can he had set ablaze. The curtains caught fire. The flames licked up the dry wallpaper. "It is over." "Maddox!" Cole shouted, raising his shotgun. Maddox turned, his face twisted in a snarl. He threw a heavy ledger at Cole and dove for the window. Cole deflected the book and lunged. He didn't shoot. He needed the man alive to hang. He tackled Maddox into the desk. The impact knocked the burning trash can over, spilling flaming papers across the oiled wooden floor. The room went up like a matchbox. Maggie scrambled on the floor, ignoring the heat, grabbing the papers that hadn't burned yet. She saw a thick folder tied with string. Lane property. She grabbed it. She grabbed another. Peterson claim. The fire roared, consuming the oxygen. The ceiling beams, weakened by the heat, groaned ominously. Cole and Maddox were wrestling in the corner. Maddox was strong, desperate. He clawed at Cole's eyes. Cole slammed his head against the floorboards, stunning him. "Leave him!" Maggie screamed. "The roof!" Cole looked up. A massive oak beam directly above them was cracking, glowing red. He grabbed Maddox by the collar and dragged him toward the door. Maddox was dead weight, half conscious. Cole threw Maddox into the hallway. Then he turned back for Maggie. She was clutching the papers, disoriented by the smoke. "Cole," she coughed. He grabbed her. "Go!" As he shoved her through the doorway, the ceiling gave way. The beam came down with the weight of judgment. It missed Maggie by inches, but it caught Cole. It slammed across his back and shoulder, pinning him to the burning floor. "Cole!" Maggie screamed. Reaching back, the pain was blinding. Cole felt ribs crack. He felt the fire searing his coat. He couldn't breathe. "Run!" He rasped. "No!" Maggie dropped the papers in the hall and grabbed his arm. She pulled with everything she had. "Get up!" she shrieked. "You promised! You promised you wouldn't leave me!" Cole gritted his teeth. He thought of the fire that had haunted him for years. He thought of the ghosts. And then he looked at Maggie's face, illuminated by the flames, terrified and fierce. Not this time, he thought. He. "I am not losing this one." With a roar of agony, he pushed himself up. He leveraged his good shoulder against the burning timber. His muscles screamed. He heaved the beam up just enough to slide his leg free. He collapsed into Maggie's arms. She dragged him. He stumbled, half crawling, his legs refusing to work. They fell out of the bank's front door and tumbled down the steps into the dirt of the street just as the roof of the office collapsed inward with a sound like thunder. Cole lay face down in the dirt, unmoving. "Cole!" Maggie crawled to him. She turned him over. His face was gray, covered in ash and blood. His breath was coming in shallow. Gurgling gasps. A trickle of bright red blood ran from the corner of his mouth. "No, no, no," Maggie whispered. She cradled his head in her lap. The crowd gathered around them in a wide circle. Maddox had been grabbed by the townspeople as he crawled out the side door. He was being held down by 4 men. Wallace was nowhere to be seen, having fled into the night, but Maggie saw none of it. She saw only Cole. She pressed her hands to his chest, as if she could force her own heart to beat for him. "Stay with me," she begged, her voice raw. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to save me and then die. Do you hear me? Cole Harper?" She looked up at the crowd. Her eyes were wild. "Help him!" she screamed. "Someone help him! Doctor! Miller!" An older man with whiskey on his breath but steady hands pushed through the crowd. He knelt beside Cole, putting his ear to his chest. "He is hurt bad," Miller said grimly. Something crushed him inside. "We need to get him to the clinic. Now!" 4 men stepped forward, the same men who had looked at Cole with suspicion yesterday. They lifted him gently, carrying him on a detached door like a fallen king. Maggie walked beside them, holding Cole's limp hand. She didn't let go. Not when they navigated the debris. Not when they entered the makeshift clinic in the back of the barber shop. She laid the stack of singed papers on the doctor's table. "Read them," she told the sheriff, who had finally found his spine. "Read everything?" Then she turned her back on the justice she had fought so hard for. It didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered but the shallow rise and fall of Cole's chest. The sun rose on a changed world. The fires were out, leaving behind black scars on the land and the smell of wet ash. Ash Hollow was quiet. It was a silence of exhaustion and shame. Maddox was in irons in the cellar of the jail. Wallace had been caught trying to board a train 10 miles east. He was being brought back to face the people he had deceived. But at the barber shop, the battle was still raging. Maggie sat on the wooden step outside the door. She had been there for 6 hours. She hadn't washed the soot from her face. Her hands were black with it. Her dress was stiff with dried mud and blood. Cole's blood. She felt hollowed out. She felt as though she was hanging over a precipice by a single, fraying thread. Inside. Doctor. Miller had been working. There had been sounds, groans of pain that made Maggie squeeze her eyes shut, the clinking of instruments, the murmur of voices. Now, it was silent. Maggie pressed her palm against the rough wood of the door. "If he dies," she thought, the words echoing in her mind like a curse, "then the fire wins. If he dies, then all of this, the fighting, the pain, the surviving, it was all for nothing. It means that the world is just a place where things burn and nothing grows." She closed her eyes. "You chose to stand in front of the fire," she whispered to the wood. "You stood in front of it for me. Do not let it take you. Cole, please." The latch clicked. Maggie scrambled to her feet, her heart stopping. "Doctor." Miller opened the door. He looked exhausted. His white shirt was stained crimson. He wiped his glasses with a rag, his hands shaking slightly. He looked at Maggie. He saw the terror in her eyes, the absolute shattering fragility of her hope. "He is stubborn," the doctor said, his voice raspy. Maggie stopped breathing. "He has 3 broken ribs." Miller said, "A collapsed lung, burns on his back, and he has lost a lot of blood. But," Maggie whispered. "But he is alive," Miller said. Maggie let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. Her knees buckled, and she had to grab the door frame to stay upright. "He woke up a minute ago," Miller continued. "He asked for you, said he wouldn't take any laudanum until he saw you. Can I—" Maggie gestured to the room. Miller stepped aside. "Go on, but be gentle. He is hanging on. Miss Lane, but I think he needs a reason to keep fighting." Maggie nodded. She wiped the tears from her cheeks, smearing the soot into war paint. She straightened her spine. She stepped into the dim room. It smelled of antiseptic and blood. Cole was lying on a narrow table, covered in a white sheet up to his chest. His face was pale as death, the bruises standing out starkly against his skin. His breathing was shallow and raspy, but his eyes were open, dark, flinty, and fixed on the door. When he saw her, his lips twitched in a ghost of a smile. Maggie walked to the side of the table. She reached out and took his hand. It was cold, but his fingers curled weakly around hers. "You look like hell," Cole whispered, his voice a broken wheeze. "You should see the other guy," Maggie said, tears spilling over again. She leaned down, pressing her forehead against his hand. "You stayed," she whispered. "I told you," Cole rasped, each word a struggle. "I'm not running anymore." Maggie looked at him. She saw the pain in his eyes, but she also saw the life. It was a flickering flame, weak and battered by the wind, but it was there. "Then don't," she said fiercely. "You keep breathing. Cole Harper, you hear me? We have a valley in Wyoming to find. We have a house to build. You do not get to quit now." Cole looked at her. He saw the future in her face. He saw the green valley. He saw the peace he had stopped believing in. "Yes, ma'am," he whispered. Maggie pulled a chair close to the table. She sat down, holding his hand in both of hers, anchoring him to the earth. She wasn't going anywhere. She would sit there and breathe for him until he was strong enough to do it himself. Outside, the town of Ash Hollow began to wake up to its new reality. But inside the room, the only reality that mattered was the steady, stubborn beat of two hearts that had walked through the fire and come out the other side. Payne was a country Cole Harper knew well. He had lived within its borders for most of his life, mapping its peaks and valleys with every scar on his body. But this pain was different. It was a heavy, crushing weight that sat squarely on his chest, making every breath a negotiation with his own ribs. He drifted in the darkness for a long time, hearing voices that sounded like they were coming from underwater. He heard the snap of burning wood, the scream of a horse, the roar of a crowd. But through the chaos, there was one sound that acted as a tether, a thin silver line pulling him back toward the surface. "Stay with me. You do not get to leave." Cole opened his eyes. The light was dim, filtering through a dusty window that smelled of iodine and lye soap. He was lying on a narrow cot, his torso wrapped so tightly in linen bandages that he felt like a mummy. He turned his head, a movement that sent a spike of agony shooting down his spine. Maggie was there. She was sitting in a wooden chair pulled close to the bed, her head resting on the mattress near his hand. She was asleep, but her grip on his fingers was iron tight. Cole looked at her. Her face was scrubbed clean of the soot, but the shadows under her eyes were purple and deep. Her hair was loose, falling across her cheek in a golden curtain. She looked exhausted, worn down to the very fiber of her being, and she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He tried to speak, but his throat was as dry as the alkali flats. He managed a rasping cough. Maggie jerked awake instantly. Her head snapped up, her blue eyes wide and panicked. When she saw his eyes open, the panic dissolved into a relief so profound it looked like pain. "Cole," she breathed. "Water," he croaked. She was on her feet in a second, pouring water from a pitcher into a tin cup. She slipped her arm behind his head, lifting him gently. Even that small movement made his vision blur, but he drank greedily, the cool water soothing the fire in his throat. She lowered him back down, her hand lingering on his forehead, brushing back his hair. "You scared me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You scared me to death. Cole Harper, I am hard to kill," Cole whispered, forcing a faint smile. "I have been told I am too stubborn for heaven and too much trouble for hell." Maggie didn't smile. Tears welled up in her eyes, spilling over to track down her cheeks. She squeezed his hand. "Don't," she said, fierce. "Do not make a joke of it, Doctor," Miller said. "He said it was a miracle the beam didn't crush your heart." Cole looked at her, his expression sobering. He remembered the bank, the heat, the weight of the timber. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Sorry?" Maggie looked confused. "For what?" "For dragging you into this," Cole said. "For the fire. For the danger. You should have been halfway to Wyoming." Maggie went still. Her eyes flashed with a sudden, sharp anger. She leaned down, her face inches from his. "Stop it," she commanded. "Do not ever apologize for saving my life, and do not insult me by pretending I was a passenger in this. I walked into that fire with you. I chose this." She took a breath, her voice softening. "You didn't drag me anywhere. Cole, you held me up." Cole looked at her, silenced by her ferocity. He saw the strength in her jaw, the fire in her eyes. She wasn't the terrified girl in the stagecoach anymore. She was a woman who had walked through hell and come out the other side holding the devil's own ledger. He turned his hand over, interlacing his fingers with hers. "How long?" he asked. 3 days, Maggie said. "You have been out for 3 days. And the town?" Cole asked, the old instinct for danger rising. "Maddox?" Maggie sat back, a grim satisfaction settling on her features. "The town is quiet," she said. "Maddox is in the cellar of the jail. The territorial marshal arrived yesterday. They are taking him to Denver to stand trial. The papers we found, they were enough. Land fraud, arson, attempted murder. He is finished." "Cole, and Wallace?" Cole asked. "Gone," Maggie said. "He tried to come back to the church yesterday to give a sermon. The deacons locked the doors on him. They say he is heading east, running back to whatever hole he crawled out of." Cole let out a long breath, his chest aching. "It is over?" "Yes," Maggie whispered, resting her head on his shoulder. "Careful of the bandages. It is finally over." Recovery was a slow, frustrating business for a man used to breaking horses and building fences. For the next week, Cole was confined to the back room of the barber shop which served as the clinic. Doctor Miller was a stern warden, and Maggie was a relentless guard. But while Cole healed, the town of Ash Hollow began to change. The reckoning was quiet but thorough. With Maddox behind bars and Wallace exiled, the fear that had strangled the valley began to lift. People started talking to one another again, not in whispers, but in normal voices. They also started remembering. They remembered how quickly they had turned on Maggie 4 years ago. They remembered the stones they had thrown, the names they had called. They remembered how they had let a preacher tell them who to hate instead of using their own eyes. Shame is a powerful thing. It hung over the town like a low cloud. When Maggie walked from the clinic to the boarding house where she was staying, men stepped off the boardwalk to let her pass, removing their hats. They didn't meet her eyes. Women who had pulled their skirts away from her a week ago now nodded quickly, their face flushing red. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't friendship. It was the awkward, painful realization that they had been wrong, and that the woman they had cursed was the one who had saved their town from burning. One afternoon, the town council came to the clinic. It was a group of 5 men, led by the banker, Mr. Thorne. They stood by Cole's bed, hats in hands, looking uncomfortable. "Mr. Harper, Mr. Thorne began, clearing his throat. "Miss Lane, the town. We want to make things right." Cole watched them from the pillow, his face impassive. "You can start by giving Miss Lane her name back." "We know," Thorne said hurriedly. "The charges, the old accusations, they have been formally struck from the record. Maddox's confession cleared everything. Miss Lane is innocent. We all know that now." Maggie stood by the window, her arms crossed. She said nothing. Thorne continued, sweating slightly. "Regarding the damages, the suffering you both endured, the town has seized Maddox's assets pending the trial. There is a great deal of land. The council has voted. We want to offer you the deed to the River Valley Tract. It is the best grazing land in the county. Green grass, good water. It is yours, free and clear, as compensation." Cole looked at Maggie. It was a king's ransom. That land would make them wealthy. It would make them respectable. Maggie turned from the window. She looked at the men, her expression unreadable. "I do not want the River Valley Tract," she said clearly. Thorne blinked. "Miss Lane, it is worth $5,000. "I do not care what it is worth," Maggie said. "I do not want Maddox's prize, and I do not want your guilt money." "Then what do you want?" Thorne asked. Maggie walked to the table where a map of the valley was spread out. She placed a finger on a spot south of town, a spot marked by charred timber and ash. "I want this," she said. "The south pasture, the plot my father leased, the one where the fire started last week." Thorne frowned. "But, Miss Lane, that land is ruined. It is scorched earth. The barn is gone. The grass is dead. It is worth nothing. It is worth everything to me," Maggie said, her voice hard. "That is where my story started. That is where you tried to end it. I want the deed to that land, and I want it recorded today." Cole watched her, a swell of pride rising in his chest that hurt more than his broken ribs. She didn't want the easy path. She wanted the battlefield. "Give her the land," Cole rasped. Thorne looked between them, confused but eager to resolve the debt. "Very well. If that is your wish, we will draw up the papers." When they left, Cole looked at Maggie. "You know that land is nothing but ash and rock right now." He said, "I know," Maggie said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "We could have taken the river land," Cole said gently. "We could have sold it and gone anywhere. California, Oregon. I am done running." "Cole," she said, taking his hand, "and I do not want a life that is given to me as an apology. I want to build something, and I want to build it right there, on the scorch." She squeezed his fingers. "I want to show them that fire doesn't win. I want to show them that we can grow a garden in the ash." 2 weeks later, Cole was strong enough to ride, though the doctor warned him that if he lifted anything heavier than a saddle, he would be back in the clinic. They rode out to the south pasture in the late afternoon. The day was crisp, the heat of summer finally breaking into the cool promise of autumn. The land was exactly as Thorne had described it, bleak. The fire had scoured it clean. The earth was black, covered in a layer of fine gray ash that swirled around the horses' hooves. The skeletons of burnt sagebrush poked up like blackened fingers. The air still held the faint, acrid scent of charred cedar. It was ugly. It was desolate. Cole reined in Ghost and looked around. He felt a heavy stone settle in his stomach. He saw the work it would take. He saw the ghosts of the flames dancing on the ridge. "Are you sure about this, Maggie?" he asked quietly. Maggie dismounted. She walked out into the middle of the blackened field. Her blue dress was a splash of color against the monochrome world. She knelt down, scooping up a handful of the scorched earth. She let it sift through her fingers. "I am sure," she said. Cole climbed down stiffly, wincing as his boots hit the ground. He walked over to her. "People are still talking. You know," he said. "Let them talk," Maggie said, not looking up. "They say I am a fool for trusting a drifter," Cole said. "They say you are a fallen woman for living with me without a ring. They say this land is cursed and we will starve by winter." Maggie stood up, brushing the dirt from her hands. She turned to face him. The wind caught her hair, blowing it across her face. "Do you care?" she asked. Cole looked at the town in the distance. "I care that they might be right about the starving part. I care that I might not be enough to keep you safe here." He took a step closer, his eyes searching hers. "Maggie, I am terrified," he admitted. His voice was low, stripped of its usual grit. "Terrified of what? Of failing you?" He said, "Of waking up one night and smelling smoke again. I am damaged goods. Maggie, I have more scars than skin. You deserve a man who is whole, a man who can give you a soft life." Maggie looked at him. She saw the fear behind his eyes, the deep-seated belief that he was unworthy of happiness. She stepped into his space, pressing her body against his. She reached up and took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "Softness did not save me." "Cole," she said fiercely. "You did." She ran her thumbs over his cheekbones. "Being scared does not mean we are broken," she told him. "It means we know what the fire can do. It means we know what we stand to lose." Her voice thickened, becoming husky with emotion. "I do not want a man who is whole and ignorant. I want you. I want your scars. I want your history, because it matches mine." She leaned her forehead against his chin. "I do not want to spend another night in that boarding house. Cole, I do not want to pretend I can sleep without hearing your heart." She pulled back slightly, looking deep into his dark eyes. The sun was setting behind the blackened hills, casting a red glow over the ruined land. "Do you remember what I said to you? In the stagecoach?" Cole nodded. "I remember every word. I was afraid of dying then," she whispered. "I wanted you to touch me because I thought it was the end." She took his hand and placed it on her waist, pulling him tight against her. "Touch me before it is too late," she whispered. But the words were different now. They weren't a plea from the edge of death. They were an invitation to life. They were a challenge. "Touch me before we waste another second. Touch me before the sun goes down on another day where we are not together. Choose me, Cole," she said, "fully, right now, on this burnt ground." Cole looked at her, and the last wall around his heart crumbled into dust. He saw the future in her eyes. It wasn't easy. It wasn't safe, but it was theirs. He let out a shuddering breath and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her so close that he could feel the beat of her heart against his own broken ribs. "I choose you," he whispered into her hair. "I choose you every day until the fire takes me." He kissed her then, a slow, deep, burning kiss that tasted of hope and ash. His hands trembled slightly on her back, not from weakness, but from the overwhelming reverence of holding the one thing in the world he couldn't bear to lose. They stood there as the stars came out, two silhouettes against the vast, darkening sky, holding each other up on the land they would heal together. Later, they sat on a fallen log that had been stripped of its bark by the flames. The air was cold, but they shared the warmth of a single blanket Cole had brought from his saddlebag. "We should build the house on the rise," Maggie said, pointing to a small hillock. "It will have a view of the canyon. It will catch the wind there." Cole noted practically. "Then we will build it strong," she countered. "Stone foundation, thick beams." Cole nodded. "Stone is good. Hard to burn stone." He was quiet for a moment, tracing the line of her knuckles with his thumb. "We should get married," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Maggie smiled, squeezing his hand. "I was wondering when you would ask." "I am not asking for a spectacle." Cole grumbled. "I do not want the town staring at us. I do not want a party." "Good," Maggie said, "because I do not want a white dress. It would just get dirty out here." "Just us," Cole said. "And maybe the preacher from the next county. Wallace isn't invited." Maggie laughed, a bright, clear sound that seemed to startle the silence of the valley. "Just us," she agreed. "And maybe Eli. He deserves to see something good happen." Cole kissed her temple. "Just us." The months that followed were not a fairy tale. They were a testament to the stubbornness of life. Winter came early and hard, burying the blackened valley in 3 feet of snow. They lived in a canvas tent for the first month while Cole built a small, rough shack to get them through the freeze. It was cold, cramped, and smelled of wet wool and wood smoke. But to Cole and Maggie, it was a palace. When the spring finally broke, the miracle happened. Cole was out early one morning, checking the fence line he had started to rebuild. He looked down at the ground. Pushing up through the black, scorched soil were tiny, vibrant spears of green. The grass was coming back. He ran back to the shack. "Maggie, you need to see this." They stood together in the mud, looking at the green shoots. "Life feeds on ash," Maggie said softly. "It is the best fertilizer." By summer, the house began to take shape. It wasn't grand, but it was solid. They hauled river stones for the foundation, working side by side until their hands were raw. Cole lifted beams that would have broken a lesser man, his back protesting but holding. Maggie mixed mortar, planted a garden of hardy vegetables, and laughed when the chickens she bought chased Cole across the yard. The town watched from a distance. At first, they expected failure. Then, they saw persistence. Slowly, hesitantly, the ice thawed, misses. Talbot stopped her wagon one day and left a basket of apple seedlings by the fence post without a word. The blacksmith rode out and helped Cole forge the hinges for the front door, accepting only a glass of lemonade as payment. Eli came every Sunday, sitting on a crate and telling stories while he helped Maggie weed the garden. They weren't embraced. Exactly. They were still the couple who lived on the edge, the ones who had walked through the fire, but they were respected, and they were happy. It was a hard-won, quiet happiness, forged in the knowledge that they had survived the worst the world could throw at them. 1 year later, late autumn, the wind was blowing from the north, carrying the scent of dry leaves. The grass in the south pasture had grown tall and thick, a golden ocean waving in the breeze. Cole stood at the edge of the property, a torch in his hand. Maggie stood beside him. She wore a simple work dress, her hair tied back, her hand resting on the slight swell of her stomach. "Are you ready?" Cole asked. Maggie looked at the field. It was time. The brush needed to be cleared to protect the new barn they had built. A controlled burn. "I am ready," she said. Cole lowered the torch. He touched the flame to the dry grass. Instantly, the fire caught. It crackled and hissed, orange tongues licking upwards. For a split second, the old fear grabbed Maggie's throat. The smell of smoke, the heat, the memory of the screams. She felt Cole's hand tighten around hers. He wasn't looking at the fire. He was looking at her. "We control it," he said calmly. "It does not control us." Maggie took a deep breath. She let the fear wash over her and then drain away into the earth. She looked at the fire. It was moving in a slow, straight line, eating the dead brush, making way for the new growth that would come in the spring. It was just fire, a tool, a force of nature. It wasn't a monster. She leaned her head on Cole's shoulder. "It is beautiful," she whispered. Cole wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. They watched the flames dance, two people standing on their own land, fearless and free. The fire burned, but it could not touch them. Their love was a steadier flame, burning hot and bright against the cold western wind, strong enough to outlast the smoke, strong enough to outlast the past, strong enough to last forever. Thank you for listening to this story. Touch me before it's too late. It has been a journey through the smoke and the flames with Cole and Maggie, and I hope you felt the heat of their struggle and the warmth of their redemption. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Are you on the open plains, in a busy city, or somewhere across the ocean? Please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on the story. If you enjoyed this tale of the American West, please consider subscribing to From Wild West. I have many more stories of cowboys, outlaws, and the powerful love that tamed the frontier waiting for you. Until next time, keep your fire burning bright.